Bavaria, established an elaborate trading system in which cigarettes were used as money. Now, the camp contained about 50,000 prisoners of many different nationalities and, of course, then, many different tastes. Red Cross parcels provided a somewhat regular supply both of cigarettes and of foodstuffs to the prisoners in the camp. Very, very quickly, prisoners began to use cigarettes as money. Now, non-smokers were always willing to trade coffee, tea, and other foods for cigarettes, knowing that they could use those cigarettes to buy goods and services they preferred. That bears emphasis here. Non-smokers accepted cigarettes, even though they didn't intend to smoke them, because they knew that they could use them in turn to buy what they wanted. So an advantage of the choice of cigarettes as money was that everyone, non-smokers and smokers alike, would always accept them in exchange for food. They understood that smokers would ultimately demand them, and that understanding led to confidence that cigarettes would hold their value. Now, there were disadvantages of using cigarettes as money. The most important disadvantage is that prices of goods in terms of cigarettes would fluctuate. When Red Cross parcels first arrived in the camp, cigarettes were very plentiful. What would happen then? Well, people were willing to give a lot of cigarettes in order to get, say, tinned beef, and prices would rise. If a long amount of time had passed without new Red Cross parcels, smokers assured that cigarettes were coming relatively scarce, and then prices would fall. This variation in prices made camp life somewhat difficult. But keep in mind that cigarettes really did function as money. They were accepted in trade not only by smokers, but by non-smokers alike, who understood that they could later exchange them for things they wanted. This is not simply playing house. The cigarette money made a difference in the camp. Many more trades were accomplished because of these cigarette monies. And those trades were very, very important to the imprisoned officers who made them. Let's look for a more recent example. In 1989, Frank Tortoriello, owner of a delicatessen in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, wanted to move his deli and sought a loan from his local bank. Unfortunately, the bank denied his loan application, leaving him without the means to move his delicatessen. But with guidance from the Schumacher Society, Tortoriello issued deli dollars, which promised $10 worth of merchandise at the deli. Tortoriello sold the deli dollars for $8 each to individuals who gave them as gifts and purchased them for their own use. He raised sufficient funds to move his deli. Deli dollars were well designed. They had staggered redemption dates so that the deli would not be forced to redeem them all in a short period of time. In this way, Tortoriello had an inflow of cash as well as deli dollars. And this example seems to me to be an interesting combination of a local currency and a kind of microfinance scheme. Deli dollars permitted Tortoriello to borrow from his future customers. The discount they received functioned like interest on the loan they made to him. The promise of future meals provided security that the customers valued more than the bank that had turned down Tortoriello's loan application. Now, while deli dollars resembled currency, there are no accounts that I know of third parties accepting them. That is, the deli dollars were created by the deli owner, sold to current and future deli customers, and then later represented to the deli owner in exchange for meals. But I can find no accounts of the deli dollars being used to, say, buy goods at the Great Barrington hardware store. But I do have another example where a local currency certainly did and continues to circulate as money. In 1991, Paul Glover spearheaded the movement to issue Ithaca hours in Ithaca, New York, the home of Cornell University. Glover issued 2 free Ithaca hours, each with a face value of $10, to people who would agree to accept them and to be listed in a publication called Our Town. Nice play on words, isn't it? H-O-U, our town. By 2000, according to Glover, thousands of Ithacans routinely accepted and spent Ithaca hours. Now, I can verify that. I was able to acquire Ithaca hours myself on the one occasion when I happened to visit the farmers market in Ithaca. Notice an important difference between Ithaca hours and Delhi dollars. Ithaca hours are not sold by a firm that is trying to raise funds for its own use. Glover gave Ithaca hours away to subscribers who agreed to spend them locally and accept them from others. Also, Ithaca hours function like a real currency. They travel between various Ithaca citizens and Ithaca businesses and stay in circulation. Delhi dollars made a single round trip. Delhi, customer, Delhi. Ithaca hours keep traveling. So, what's that project all about? Well, the purpose of the Ithaca Hours project is to promote the local economy in Ithaca. Since Ithaca hours are not accepted outside the town, indeed they're hardly known about outside the town, except for people like me who study them, anyone who accepts an Ithaca hour certificate in exchange for some good or service is making essentially a commitment to spend that certificate with another local merchant or service provider. And indeed, that's the point. Ithaca Hours is a scheme to promote the development of the local economy in Ithaca. Closer to my home, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, we too have a local currency. It's called the Plenty, standing for Piedmont Local Economy Tender. The Plenty is widely accepted in Orange, Alamance, and Chatham County. And there is a catalog in which people and businesses who are willing to accept Plenty can indicate their willingness to do so in the catalog and online. The Plenty is a similar scheme to the Ithaca Hour. It is meant to stimulate the rural community just to the west of Chapel Hill. In addition to local currencies, there is another type of non-standard financial arrangement that addresses the desire of individuals to coordinate their economic activity, but now through the process of lending and borrowing funds. The motivation for this is easily understood, but I'd like to capture the motivation in a parable. Imagine with me for a moment a remote village without any connection to a modern financial institution. It might be in Polynesia, it might be in Africa. You use your own imagination. Most likely, the village is going to be located in an underdeveloped country. Or perhaps it was a village in a much earlier time. Now that we've fixed our image, suppose further that in the village there are 10 families. The number's arbitrary, but stick with 10. Each family would like to own a bicycle. None has one. One family would use the bicycle to haul vegetables to market. Maybe a second family would convert the bicycle into a rickshaw and start a business. I imagine a third family would allow their 2 children to ride the bicycle to a town 20 miles away where they could attend a better school, and so forth. Left to their own devices, each of the 10 families could save up to buy their bicycle. Imagine a service of bicycle cost about $100. And imagine that in this rural area, each family could scrape together about $10 of savings per year. Then all 10 families could have a bicycle, but all 10 families would have to wait 10 years. And all 10 families would end up buying the bicycle at about the same time. What a waste! Each family would hide its savings in a secure place, waiting for the day when they had accumulated the price of a bicycle. For 10 years, all those funds would remain idle. After the 10 years, the aggregated saving of the 10 families would be $1,000, but only then would they be able to buy a bicycle. 1 year before, they would have in aggregate $900, but none of them would be able to buy a bicycle. That seems like a real waste to me. Is there a better arrangement? Well, maybe there is. Suppose the 10 families made an agreement. Each year, the 10 families would meet in the village center, perhaps sharing supper first, but certainly bringing with them the $10 they had saved in the past year. The families perhaps would draw lots, and the winning family would receive $100 to buy a bicycle, $10 from each of the 10 families. After 1 year, one family would have a bicycle. After the second year, a second family would have their bicycle. And so forth and so on. Only one family out of the 10 would have to wait the full 10 years to buy a bicycle. Now, other ways to decide the order in which families obtain their bicycles would be possible. Perhaps the families would bid for the right to go next. Or perhaps there would be some sort of meritocracy where the village headman would say, you have made an important contribution, you get to go next. Not important now. The important thing is that the accumulated saving of the 10 families would be put to work every single year. This is something they could do together and something they could not do family by family. The cooperative arrangement seems clearly superior to the go-it-alone arrangement described at the outset where everyone waits. But will it work? One potential flaw is that the families who have already gotten a bicycle have an incentive to stop making their $10 annual contribution. That's important because if any family doubts that other families will continue to make payments, they may reach the conclusion that the cooperative arrangement is very risky and never participate. They would prefer to go it alone. Can we solve this problem? What sort of a mechanism could ensure that families would follow through, keep their promise, and make their payments every year, even though they already had gotten their bicycle? Well, there are lots of possibilities. One possibility would be that the village headman would ostracize any family that broke the commitment. A second possibility is that each family would agree in advance to forfeit the bicycle if they fail to make their promised payments. Other solutions are possible, and you can think of them, but it's clear that some enforcement mechanism would be necessary. Sticking with this theme of cooperative financial arrangements of a non-standard sort, let me point out that the benefits from providing even small loans to individuals are potentially very large. And institutions that embody the spirit of cooperation have sprung up to fill this potential. As the parable suggests, there are many situations in which every member of the group could benefit from a coordinated arrangement to save funds and lend them out to group members. The story also underscores another important theme. There are many groups of individuals who, for a variety of reasons, do not have access to traditional lending institutions. Throughout the course of history, individuals who wanted to borrow but were unable to secure loans from banks and other standing lending institutions sought alternatives. I'm going to ask you next time you drive through your city to keep your eyes open and think differently about something you may see, the pawn shop. Pawn shops are very, very old institutions that have traditionally provided credit to those who could not obtain it from banks. How does a pawn arrangement work? Well, to obtain credit from a pawn shop, the would-be borrower would bring some physical object to the shop, such as a musical instrument, a piece of jewelry, a tool. In the southwest of the United States, Native Americans traditionally bring handmade jewelry. The shop owner, the pawn shop owner, would lend the borrower an amount less than the estimated value of the object offered in pawn and retain the object as collateral. If the borrower paid back what was owed, the borrower would get the item back. If not, the pawn shop owner would sell the item to recoup the amount of the loan. And then we might have an opportunity to buy it as old pawn. Okay. It follows that one mechanism for providing credit to an otherwise underserved population are these non-standard arrangements, popularly talked about as rotating saving and credit associations, or ROSCA, R-O-S-C-A. There are lots of examples through history and across place of ROSCAs, including Tontine in the Cameroon and Tanda in Mexico. These arrangements are alike in most respect. They're cooperative arrangements where people gather together and pool their savings. The way Tontines are different from Tanda and other ROSCAs are that the enforcement mechanism is different. Two important issues faced by a ROSCA are how to determine the order in which participants receive funds and how to ensure individuals fulfill their promises to make contributions to the ROSCA. Many ROSCAs use lotteries to determine who will next receive the funds, and they use social consequences to enforce the contract. Now I'd like to turn to a far more organized, non-standard financial arrangement and tell you yet one more story. In 1976, Professor Muhammad Yunus, head of the Rural Economics Program at the University of Chittagong, launched a project to examine the possibility of designing a credit delivery system to provide banking and lending services targeted to the rural poor. Now, you may know that Yunus won the Nobel Peace Prize for his activity in 2006. The result of Yunus's initiative is today called the Grameen Bank, and Grameen means rural or village in the Bangla language. The classic Grameen Bank model relies on group lending. Grameen clients are too poor to offer collateral, but tend to have close ties to a community. So Grameen borrowers must first form groups whose members monitor and support one another, help one another to fulfill their repayment obligations. Groups number 5 and 2 members of the group can receive a loan at any one time. If a group defaults and doesn't repay what it borrows, every member of the group is barred from receiving future loans. Giannis realized that the marginal value, the marginal productivity of the investment that was made possible by a very small loan to poor people was very high. Borrowers, he believed, could repay because the loans, although small, led to very profitable investments, very valuable, productive investments. Another enforcement mechanism used by the Grameen Bank model is progressive lending. What's that mean? Well, progressive lending makes available larger and larger loans to groups of individuals who have successfully paid back earlier, smaller loans. Why is it incentive? Well, someone who receives a small loan, uses it, and repays it, finds him or herself in the position where their group can now seek bigger loans and undertake bigger projects. The Grameen model has been hugely successful. For example, in Bangladesh alone, the Grameen Bank grew from nothing to 1 million members by 1991 and to 7.5 million members by June of 2008. Recently, the Grameen Bank has come under scrutiny from a variety of government agencies. Some critics question whether microfinance does have the beneficial impact on poverty that the bank claims. Other critics, especially those in government, are simply threatened by the growth of the bank and the power of Giannis himself. Still other critics claim that microfinance arrangements are wrong because they charge high interest rates to their clients. What we have learned here is that financial arrangements are not only the business of Wall Street. Citizens of Main Street understand the power of monetary arrangements to coordinate economic activity. And as our examples of local currencies have shown, they at times have themselves created monies to accomplish local economic objectives. Finance is just not the business of the wealthy. The poor can benefit greatly from the ability to borrow and invest. The microfinance model uses non-traditional ways to enforce agreements to repay and have proved successful arrangements throughout the world. Groups of individuals have sought ways to coordinate their economic activity that frequently transcend traditional models of money and banking. Local currencies and microfinance arrangements are two types of institutions that thrive even amidst a multitude of highly financed traditional institutions. Thank you.
Lecture 6. How Inflation Erodes the Value of Money.
Inflation is a lot like a snake. We know we're afraid, but we aren't quite sure why. Naturalists explain that you can identify most poisonous snakes in the United States by the triangular shape of their heads. But who wants to get that close? Inflation is somewhat the same. Some inflation is benign, some is poisonous. And it's really important to know the difference. In this lecture, we will learn that it is rational to fear high rates of inflation, and in particular, volatile inflation histories, when the inflation rate swings between high and low values. Why? High rates of inflation erode the value of money. Now, farmers who store their grains in silos know that rot will claim some of their grain every month. Inflation is like rot. It erodes the value of our money by lowering the amount of goods we can buy with it. Inflation is bad enough. Volatile inflation, inflation that oscillates between low and high rates, is even worse. Why? Volatile inflation makes planning for the future very difficult. We begin today's lecture with a report card of sorts, a look at the inflation history of the United States over the last 100 years. That history shows that there have been several periods where inflation caused real problems for U.S. decision makers. These are periods where economists and history, and probably you too, gives monetary authorities low marks. But they're also periods from which we must learn. We must learn in order to understand better how to control inflation in the future. After looking at some history, we zero in and ask precisely what inflation is, and we investigate the connection between money growth and inflation. And finally, we ask in some detail why economists say that inflation is costly. In the post-World War II period, the United States had decades when inflation was very high and very volatile, and decades when inflation was low and steady. In the high inflation decades, individuals spent substantial time and energy devising strategies that would protect them from unforeseen increases in inflation. For example, and I'll talk about this more later, they bought larger houses than they otherwise would have, hoping that house prices would keep up with inflation. In low inflation decades, individuals save that time and that energy and plan for the future as if the inflation rate would remain steadily between 1% and 3%. When it did so, their decision to not use precious time and energy to hedge the risks of inflation was warranted. The graph shows the inflation rate for the U.S. economy between 1913 and 2010. What does it show? It shows that our inflation experience has varied a lot. Before the beginning of World War II, there were very large swings in the inflation rate. A high in 1920 of 24%. And a low in 1921 of nearly minus 16%. That's an enormous change over a very short period. A swing of 40% over a year or so. You can understand that wide a swing between high and low growth in the price level played havoc with many businesses and household decisions. During World War II, when wage and price controls were in effect, and immediately after the war, CPI inflation again varied greatly, swinging from about 13% in May of 1942 to 0% in May of 1944, and then 18% in May of 1947. After the 1940s, it appeared that calm had returned to the inflation history, and that inflation was under control. The inflation rate fell below 5% by the end of 1951 and stayed low for over a decade. But inflation had not been conquered. The inflation rate rose gradually in the 60s and was once more high and variable between 1970 and 1985. During that period, the Consumer Price Index inflation rate once more hit a peak of 15% in 1979. When the Volcker regime took hold at the Federal Reserve, inflation once more fell and, in fact, fell quite quickly. Since 1985, the inflation rate has largely been captured between the band of about 2 and 5%. Economists refer to the period since 1985 as the Great Moderation, and some of them talk about it as a period in which U.S. inflation was conquered. But, as we will see in this lecture and later in the course, it never pays to assume that an enemy like inflation is vanquished forever. So, what is inflation? Inflation is a persistent increase in what I will call the general level of prices. Now, right away, we need a standard for this term, general level of prices. And I'm going to use the standard which is best known to you certainly. It's the Consumer Price Index. But what's that? The Consumer Price Index is an index of prices of goods and services purchased by the typical household in the United States. Now, it's very, very important for everyone to understand that the Consumer Price Index is not the price of any one item. Even an item as important as gasoline or heating oil or natural gas. Instead, the Consumer Price Index is properly thought of as the index of the price of a bushel basket. A bushel basket full of the goods chosen by the typical family of 4 that lives in some city in the United States. What do I mean when I say that the Consumer Price Index is an index? What's that mean? Well, it means that the bushel basket prices in each month are each divided by the bushel basket price in some base year. And that base year is currently 1983. And we have a consistent agreement to set the value of the Consumer Price Index to 100 in the base year. So when you see, for example, that the CPI is 180, you know that prices are 1.8 times larger than they were in 1983. What's in the bushel basket? Well, that's determined by you. It's determined by a survey of consumer purchasing behavior conducted frequently by the Bureau of Labor Statistics of the U.S. Department of Labor. The items in the bushel basket are changed very, very slowly, so that changes in the Consumer Price Index are more due to changes in the prices of the items already in the basket and less due to changes in the items themselves. Now, that makes sense. It's supposed to be a measure of prices, so we don't want to confuse things by having changes in composition of the basket. But that does have a downside. For example, it took a while to get cell phones and cell phone services into the Consumer Price Index. It's important for you to realize that the Consumer Price Index is not truly a cost of living index. And there's a good reason why, and it's important that we all understand it. But first, let's make clear what that means. If the CPI were to grow, say, by 5% in a given year, the cost of living would grow by a smaller percentage, 2 or 3%, or something smaller. Why? Savvy consumers will move away from the items that have experienced high price increases and toward items that are good substitutes and have experienced smaller price increases. Let's do an example. Suppose there's a frost in Georgia, and that greatly increases the price of peaches. I like peaches. You probably like peaches. But if the price of peaches goes very much higher, I and you and consumers in general are likely to substitute nectarines or some other fruit for the peaches that are now very expensive. Point is that the cost of eating fruit will not rise by the same percentage as the cost of eating peaches. Now, this is important not only to you as you manage your own budgets, but it's also important in a public policy sense. The Social Security Administration uses a different price index to compute cost of living increases that feed into increases in Social Security payments made to recipients. And indeed, there is some talk in political arenas of further changing that formula to compute cost of living increases in Social Security payments. Okay, so now we understand what the Consumer Price Index is, and it's time to ask exactly what is meant by the rate of inflation. Inflation is defined as the rate of growth in a price index. So the Consumer Price Index is a number. It defines the cost of a bushel basket at a moment in time. The inflation rate explains how that number is growing, how high the growth rate is, how quickly those prices are rising. There are many, many ways to compute an inflation rate. One can choose a different price index, and there are many. One can choose a different period over which to measure changes in the chosen index. And, for that matter, one can choose a different formula for computing the growth rate. Recall that I presented some data to you about the history of inflation in the United States. What formula did I use, and what data did I use? The graph that you saw used the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers. It defined the inflation rate as a percentage change in the current month's CPI index compared with that index 12 months earlier, so those were annual growth rates. By defining the inflation rate as the percentage change over 12 months, over than 1, 2, or 3 months, I created a measure of inflation that would be less sensitive to very temporary price changes. I want to clear something up about the relationship between inflation and important prices, such as the price of oil. Let me say, with no equivocation, a one-time price increase cannot cause inflation. It will certainly cause the CPI to rise, perhaps for as long as a year. But an increase in the price of oil cannot cause inflation. It won't simply visit itself within 1 month because many goods that we produce use oil. And those prices of those goods will rise as the price of oil is incorporated into them. But an increase in the price of oil, such, for example, as was caused by the OPEC price increases in the 1970s, cannot explain persistent differences in the inflation rates that we have observed in the data that we viewed. The OPEC cartel was able to raise the price of oil relative to other goods in the 1970s. But it was not able to continue to raise the relative price of oil as the years and decades passed. And if you would like to convince yourself of that, all you need to do is to create some data of your own where the price of oil is divided by the CPI, and then take a look at the graph. What causes inflation? I have for you one of the most famous quotes in economics. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, in the sense that it is and can be produced only by a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than in output. These are famous words, and they were written by a famous economist, Milton Friedman, a Nobel laureate in economics and perhaps the most famous monetary economist of the 20th century. What Friedman meant is that growth in the money supply is both necessary and sufficient to explain inflation. Now, Friedman does not mean that all growth in the quantity of money causes inflation. Growth in money at a rate that just keeps pace with the growth in real output, with the growth rate of our economy, will not cause inflation. In fact, that growth in the money supply will facilitate the growth in real production. But Friedman does mean that growth in money in excess of the growth in real output will cause inflation. I have some evidence for you. The following charts show money growth rates and inflation rates for 79 different countries and for 2 different 5-year periods, 1987 to 92 and 1992 to 97. The data are from the International Monetary Fund, and the results depicted in the chart are similar to results reported by many other authors and economists who have studied cross-country variation in inflation and money growth. Let's begin by zooming in on the left panel, which covers the period of 87 to 92. Along the horizontal axis is measured the excess growth in the money supply. That's Friedman's concept. And here, excess growth in money means the difference between the money growth rate and the growth rate in real income in the country. Along the vertical axis is measured the inflation rate. Each point on the graph represents the 5-year inflation and money growth record of one of the 79 countries included in the study. So if you could count the dots, there would be 79. The graph shows that there was a tremendous amount of variation in the inflation and money growth experience measured across the 79 countries. Most countries experienced inflation rates of, say, less than 10%. But some had inflation rates greater than 10%, some greater than 20%, and a few greater than 50%. The graph has a line, and that is the best fit line, the line that fits the points better than any other line. When you look at that line, you notice that it appears to have a slope of about 1. What does that mean? Well, that means simply that every 1% increase in excess money growth is associated with a 1% increase in inflation. This is what Friedman meant. Higher money growth, higher inflation, and at about a 1-to-1 rate. Now let's look at the right panel. Everything in the right panel is the same as in the left panel, except that a different 5-year period, remember it's 92 through 97, is used to gauge the money growth and inflation experience of the 79 countries. What one notices right away is that the best fit line for the right panel looks identical to the best fit line of the left panel. That wasn't arbitrary. The data say that it's identical. So, looking across countries, we see the same positive, virtually 1-to-1 relationship between money growth and inflation in 92 through 97 and in 1987 through 1992. The data positively and strongly support Milton Friedman's claim that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Countries with high excess money growth have high inflations. Countries with low excess money growth have low inflation rates. Put another way, excess money growth of any percentage rate you want, call it N, is going to cause N% inflation. But why? Why does money growth in excess of the rate of growth of a nation's productivity cause inflation? Now, economists have lots and lots of models and lots of explanations explaining why. But let's keep things simple. Let's focus on the explanation that Milton Friedman himself provided. What did Friedman say? Well, Friedman said that an increase in the growth rate of money puts additional buying power in the hands of potential spenders. For example, if the increase in money growth resulted from a decision by a government to buy additional defense-related products, defense contractors and those who work for them would receive additional money. When the defense contractors and their employees spend the additional money that they have received, they bid up the prices of the goods they buy. Since they buy a wide variety of goods and services, most prices rise and inflation results. For that mechanism, the mechanism that Friedman has in mind to work as he says it does, an economy must be nearly fully employed. That means all of its resources must be put to use. If not, the increase in money could lead to higher employment without inflation, because as people spend the new money they get, they could just call unemployed resources back to work. Friedman's rule, 1-to-1 between excess money growth and inflation, is meant to be a statement about an economy that's operating at its potential. So, it's important now, having explained what a price index is, having explained what inflation is, and having explained the connection between money growth and inflation, to explain something else, and to explain it very, very clearly and convincingly. Why do I and most economists argue that high and variable inflation is very costly to the members of society? It's important to note that high and variable inflation tend to come together. The original graph showed you that bigger swings in the inflation rate occurred when inflation was high on average than in post-1985 when it was low. So what? Well, high and variable inflation, and this is very important, makes it difficult for individuals to plan for their future. Knowing how much one needs for retirement, for example, requires one to predict prices, my goodness, 30 years in advance? Imagine how hard that is. Imagine that you had planned for 2% inflation. And then, after 20 years of saving, you suddenly entered a period where you believed that inflation would grow during your retirement years at 5% per year. The dollars you had saved might simply be too few. And you may have, without choosing to, without deciding to, chosen for yourself a retirement income that wasn't as large to support a lifestyle that you had wished. Another example. Knowing how much to save for college requires one to predict college tuitions when a child is still very young. That's a difficult problem, not only because inflation tends to drive up college tuitions, but also because college tuitions can grow more or less rapidly than general prices. Hedging inflation risk is costly in the sense that decision makers do things that they would not do if they could be sure, if they could be guaranteed that inflation would remain low and steady. And I want to elaborate on an example. In the 1960s, it was common advice to young home buyers that they should buy as much house as they could afford, and maybe more, because a house was considered a good inflation hedge. Many companies would hold larger inventories of raw materials than they actually needed in order to hedge against the risk that those materials would grow in price. In addition, individuals hold less money when they fear inflation. Now, money, as I've argued several times already, is a very useful economic tool. It facilitates trade. But money loses value when inflation occurs, and people fearing inflation may actually hold less money than they would if they were guaranteed that the inflation rate would be low. It follows that people use other strategies for transactions. Some economists describe these other strategies when they say that inflation leads people to bear shoe leather costs because it leads them to make more trips to the bank to move money between interest-bearing accounts and non-interest-bearing accounts. That metaphor rings a little hollow in today's world because we do a lot of our banking electronically. But the basic point is still valid, although the shoe leather metaphor may not be. It takes time and effort to sweep out our non-interest paying accounts. We need to do that less often when inflation is low and more often when it's not, and doing so costs resources. As we near the end of today's lecture, let's reflect for a moment on why all of us are better off when the inflation rate is low and steady. Even though, as we'll see later, there are some times when it makes sense to bear the risk of higher inflation. If inflation is low and steady, it's easier to plan for the future and to have confidence that our financial arrangements will work out as we planned. We spend less of our resources hedging the risks associated with volatile inflation. We live, for example, in houses of a size justified by our desires rather than by our fears. We use more of that wonderful invention, money. On the other hand, if inflation is high and variable, it's very difficult to know how much to save for retirement, how much to save for college tuition, and so forth. If inflation is high and variable, we will invest more of our wealth in riskier assets in the hope that they will provide us some protection against inflation. We buy more house in the hope that house prices gain in value and offset the effects of inflation. We may buy more stocks and bonds than we are comfortable with. We use less of that wonderful invention, money. In the next lecture, we will study inflation in extreme situations and will learn just how damaging high inflation can be. In other lectures, we will study in greater detail the relationship between inflation and interest rates, and we will understand how and why our Federal Reserve treats as its most important job maintaining the inflation rate at a steady 2%. Thank you.
Lecture 7. Hyperinflation is the repudiation of money.
Hyperinflation is the ultimate repudiation by a government of its money. These are powerful words, but they are literally true. If the inflation rate increases to a high enough level, the real cost to a nation's government of redeeming its money in terms of goods and services is nothing. What exactly does that mean? When hyperinflation occurs, prices rise to such levels that the outstanding stock of money issued by the government in earlier times will buy virtually nothing. We have all seen cartoons where someone flaunts his or her wealth by using a $100 bill to light a cigar. The idea of burning money is so shocking that we laugh in surprise. But the world has experienced inflations of such a magnitude that citizens came to realize that their best use of their currency was to burn it as fuel. Prices in those economies had risen to such levels that a stack of currency could produce more heat by burning it than it could by using it to buy wood or coal. Happily, the United States has never experienced a hyperinflation. Oh, we've experienced periods of high inflation, such as during the Revolutionary War, when prices grew so rapidly and paper money lost value so quickly and completely that we gained an entry into the American phrase book. It's not worth a continental. Remember that the continental was the paper money of the Revolutionary War period. Perhaps you would be tempted to discount the value of today's lecture because you believe that a hyperinflation could not happen in the United States. Hold on, please stay tuned. I will explain toward the end of the lecture why our large national debt in the United States is a temptation for us and for our government, for our monetary and for our fiscal authorities to allow a very large inflation and maybe even to cause one. Look, I'm not predicting hyperinflation in the United States, but incentives matter. That's a key tenet of economic belief, and it's important as we think of our priorities as citizens to explain to ourselves why a large national debt is an incentive to cause or tolerate a large inflation. Okay, so exactly what is and what isn't a hyperinflation? We know from the previous lecture that inflation is a sustained increase in the general level of prices. We know that a one-time increase in oil prices, for example, even if it were large, is not in and of itself inflation. Inflation occurs when most items in a price index rise over time, when most items in our consumer's bushel basket have price increases. And the rate at which the price of that bushel basket increases is called the inflation rate. We have also seen that inflation is the modern-day counterpart of the ancient practice of seigniorage, where the monarch of a land would shave the coins he received in tax payments and use the shavings to mint new coins. The result of seigniorage was a decline in the value of the money held by private citizens, a transfer of wealth from those citizens to the monarch, a tax that monarch never explicitly declared or imposed. Most economists believe that job one of the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States is to keep inflation low and predictable, thereby preserving the purchasing power of our dollar. Helping you understand the causes and consequences of inflation is an important goal of this course. We study cases of extreme inflation because they're very interesting and because they have a cautionary element to them. They caution everyone to understand just how damaging to society inflation can be. Okay, for the record, the term hyperinflation is reserved by economists to describe episodes of inflation during which the monthly inflation rate is larger than 50%. I mean that. Larger than 50%. So just how much inflation is that? At a monthly inflation rate of 50%, An item that cost $1 on January 1st would cost $130 on January 1st of the following year. And that same item would cost $2,184,164 on January 1st the year after that. Yikes! It just couldn't happen, you say. It can, and it has. The ultimate cause in hyperinflation is a government's decision to finance large deficits by creating new money. To fix ideas, let's consider the most studied and best known hyperinflation of the 20th century, that occurred in Germany between 1921 and 1923. On average, between August of 1922 and November of 1923, so 15 months or so, prices in Germany rose at a monthly rate, not of 50%, 322%. This means that prices quadrupled each month during the 16 months of the hyperinflation. Imagine that happening in your life. A pound of chicken that cost $2 at the beginning of May would, if inflation was occurring at the German hyperinflation rate, cost $8 at the beginning of June. How would you run a household under those conditions? But things were going to get worse. In the last days of the German hyperinflation, the inflation rate was much higher, 41% per day in October of 1923. During the hyperinflation, the German government increased the supply of money by fantastic amounts at an average rate of 314% per month. Clearly, a hyperinflation causes great distress to the people who experience it. It would be bad enough for wage earners who receive wage increases that never seem to keep pace with inflation. But it would be devastating for individuals such as pensioners living on fixed nominal incomes fixed in marks in Germany. Imagine no increase in your income in response to these huge increases in the prices of things. Why did the German government do this to its people? Well, there's a story. As a result of the treaty that ended World War I, Germany was forced to cede equipment and territory to the victors and was required to pay substantial war reparations in gold to the victorious nations. The fact that the treaty specified payment in gold placed great strain on Germany because its gold stocks were depleted. Germany had used those to prosecute the war. And at the end of the war, its export sector was operating at a very, very low level. In short, Germany had little opportunity to gain gold to pay its reparations. The situation went from very bad to very much worse in January of 1923, when the French army occupied the Ruhr Valley because German payments had fallen below levels specified by the end-of-war treaty. What did Germany do? After the Ruhr occupation, Germany lost access to both natural resources, coalfields, for example, and the taxes that derived from their use. And Germany responded to that occupation with what they called a passive resistance that included direct payments to German citizens in the Ruhr. It paid its citizens not with gold, but with paper money. The German government kept printing money to pay for expenditures in excess of the expenditures that could be financed by tax revenues. Tax revenues were very, very small relative to expenditures, and the difference the German government financed by printing money. Interestingly, the connection between the high rates of money printing, the high rates of money creation, and ever-rising inflation rates was not acknowledged and in many cases was not understood in Germany at the time. Karl Helffrich, a prominent German economist of the time, said, and I quote, "The increase in the circulation has not preceded the rise of prices and the depreciation of the exchange rate, but it followed slowly and at a great distance. It is not possible that this increase had caused the rise in prices of imported goods and the dollar." End quote. So notice that Helffrich is making a timing argument. He is saying that money growth followed inflation rather than occurred in advance of inflation, and therefore money growth could not have caused inflation. Well, economists today, including myself, think otherwise about the causal role of money growth in hyperinflation. Once it becomes clear that government has committed to printing money to finance a substantial deficit, people expect inflation to occur. They're smart, after all. And they are reluctant to hold paper money for any period of time because they fear the loss of value that will result from inflation. A game of hot potato commences, where individuals spend money as fast as they receive it. In Germany, people would leave their workplaces during the noon hour, asking for their morning's pay, to rush to the stores to be able to convert that money to the things that they plan to eat for their supper. That's really a game of hot potato. Of course, the increasing inflation rates that result from people bidding up the prices of goods cause further damage to government finances and lead to even higher rates of money creation. The hyperinflation spiral is underway. Money creation, rising inflation, even higher rates of money creation, still higher inflation. Well, what results then is a decrease in the ratio of money to prices as individuals rationally decide to hold less wealth in the form of money. Think about that for a minute. They are lowering their desired levels of money holding even faster than prices are rising because they don't want to expose their wealth to the perils of future inflation. The money growth is causing inflation. Individuals are responding rationally by lowering the amount of money they use. Notice then how causality works in a hyperinflation. The people's belief that prices will rise ever more rapidly causes them to act in advance of the actual price increases and lower the quantity of money they hold. People purposely lessen their money balances, thereby driving prices up all the more rapidly as they spend the money they have. To those who do not understand the process, like Karl Helffrich, it would appear that inflation was causing the growth in money because the timing indicated that. But in fact, the opposite was and is true. Current and anticipated future rapid growth in the money supply causes hyperinflation. When and why did the hyperinflation in Germany end? According to Thomas Sargent, the German hyperinflation ended with a monetary reform that occurred late in 1923. But Sargent doesn't attribute the end of the hyperinflation solely to the monetary reform. He argues that three important things happened abruptly and simultaneously. Quote, additional borrowing by the government from the central bank stopped. The government budget swung into balance and inflation stopped. Notice how Sargent links the end of hyperinflation to a change in government spending and borrowing. Now, how can we square Sargent's view with Friedman's claim that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon? Well, Sargent points out that the root cause of hyperinflation, the root cause, is a government's decision to spend amounts far in excess of what tax revenues permit. In Germany, the government made direct payments to citizens as part of its passive resistance to the French occupation of the Ruhr. The government begins by borrowing funds through the issuance of bonds. Money growth occurs when the central bank buys the government bonds that the Treasury has issued, perhaps in an attempt to keep their prices from falling and their yields from rising. Fiscal reform is necessary, according to Sargent, to end a hyperinflation because without it, everyone in the nation knows that the government will continue to borrow, and the central bank will have a very strong incentive to buy the bonds issued by the government. That is, to create the money of which Friedman speaks. In a nutshell, Sargent's view is simple. A nation cannot end a hyperinflation unless it tackles the root cause that led to the hyperinflation. So we are now in a better position to understand the behavior of those Germans who could produce a fire in their stoves more cheaply by burning money than by using the money to buy coal or wood. The German hyperinflation had devastating effects on the German people. The German middle class was largely wiped out because they were unable to, by law, to raise rents of the properties they owned fast enough to compensate for rising prices. The middle class owned apartments, and the value of those apartments fell as rents were not allowed to rise. On the other hand, companies that owned large stores of commodities improved their lot during the hyperinflation. You know the name of one of those companies. It was owned by the Krupp family. Some historians go so far as to argue that the hyperinflation in Germany that raged until 1923 actually contributed to the rise of National Socialism in Germany. The German hyperinflation may be the most studied, but it's not alone. And it's not the most recent. And as we will see, it's not even the champion inflation producer. Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Uruguay each experienced a hyperinflation between 1970 and 1987. During the hyperinflations in these Latin American countries, dollarization occurred, as citizens used U.S. dollars in an attempt to avoid the loss of wealth in holding their own currencies. I myself experienced dollarization when I visited Kiev about 10 years ago in Ukraine. I could buy things as easily with U.S. dollars as I could with the local currency. And even local craftspeople who offered their handicrafts were willing to accept dollars and knew the prices they wanted to charge in dollars. Among the Latin American inflations, the Bolivian hyperinflation is an interesting case that further illustrates what Thomas Sargent had in mind. In 1982, Herman Seals Swazel took power as head of a leftist coalition that wanted to satisfy demands for more government spending on domestic programs, but faced growing debt service obligations and falling prices for tin, an important export. The Bolivian government responded by issuing bonds that were purchased by the Central Bank of Bolivia. In effect, the Bolivian government, its treasury and its central bank together, printed money to finance the regime expenditures. Faced with a shortage of funds, the Bolivian government raised revenue through an inflation tax instead of raising income taxes or reducing other government spending. One of the reasons that dollars are held throughout the world is that citizens of many nations consider the dollar to be a more dependable store of value than the currency in their own nations. Quote, U.S. currency is recognized as a symbol of stability and integrity around the world. That quote's from Michael Merritt, Deputy Assistant Director of the U.S. Secret Service. It's not widely known that the Secret Service not only protects the president, but also protects our currency from counterfeiters. The report produced by the Treasury Department, in which that quote appears, estimated that about $450 billion of the $760 billion U.S. dollars in circulation as of December 2005 is held abroad by citizens of a foreign nation. When citizens of other nations hold dollars, the U.S. collects a modest amount of seigniorage from them, approximately equal to the rate of return on U.S. Treasury bills, because holding dollars is equivalent to making the U.S. government an interest-free loan. The stable value of our currency has real advantages for us. It's something worth protecting. The rest of the world's citizens willingly pay that tax in order to avoid the risk of losing much more by holding their domestic currency. They hedge their risks by holding the U.S. dollar. Okay. Again, while the German hyperinflation is better known than others, the current hyperinflation in Zimbabwe is actually much worse. Steve Hanke of Johns Hopkins University and the Cato Institute reports that between January of 2007 and November of 2008, Zimbabwe experienced an astounding average monthly inflation of 1,124%. That is, prices rose by 11-fold every month on average. The highest monthly inflation rate during the period occurred, not surprisingly, in the final month and amounted to a daily inflation rate of just under 100%. As a byproduct of his work, Hanke has created his own rogues gallery of hyperinflations that have occurred since 1923, the year of the famous German hyperinflation that we already talked about. Hyperinflation numbers are so staggering that reporting on them and the numbers that describe them present a very big challenge. I like to think of that challenge as zero-dazzle, because you have to add so many zeros before the decimal point in order to capture accurately the monetary increases and the increases in prices. But Hanke has developed an interesting table where he provides a different way to compare hyperinflations. Hanke reports the amount of time necessary for prices to double in several famous hyperinflations. By Hanke's measure, Germany only ranks fourth among the hyperinflations. Zimbabwe ranks second. The all-time champion hyperinflation is Hungary, where at its worst, prices doubled every 15.6 hours. It would be frightening to take a nap. For Hungary, the hyperinflation occurred in 1946 prices doubled in 15.6 hours. In Zimbabwe, in November of 2008, they doubled every day. In Yugoslavia, which experienced the hyperinflation in 1994, in January, they doubled every 1.4 days. In Germany, that we've talked a lot about, in October of 1923, they doubled every 3.7 days. In Greece, in 1944, 4.5 days, and in China, in 1949, every 5.6 days. Does the government of Zimbabwe understand that it is responsible for hyperinflation? It is hard to doubt that it does, although I must say that it denies responsibility. According to the New York Times, Mr. Mugabe blames a Western plot for his nation's troubles. By now, however, you are well prepared to discount such self-serving claims. Before we end this lecture, let's refocus for a minute on why hyperinflation is so damaging. Hyperinflation destroys wealth that is held in the form of money, or in any asset with a value fixed in terms of the depreciating currency. Hyperinflation destroys the efficiency that results from the social contract inherent in the use of paper money. In Germany, it reduced most people to barter. Hyperinflation creates tremendous psychological costs as individuals worry about an uncertain future. Hyperinflation allows government to collect revenues outside the political process. Perhaps some of the citizens and politicians in the United States who worry about our federal deficits and our accumulated national debt are really worried because our debt is a temptation to create inflation in the United States. Why would we ever want to create an inflation? To lower the pain of repaying that debt. Inflation in the United States would be a repudiation, not only of our dollar, but also of our debt. And as I said at the outset, hyperinflation is the ultimate repudiation by a government of its money.
Lecture 8. Saving, the source of funds for investment.
Saving is the source of funds that makes investment possible. You will understand that expression very, very well by the time that this lecture is over. In June 2008, Car and Driver magazine reported that General Motors was undertaking a strategic review of its Hummer brand. The very same article reported that GM had decided to go forward with production of the Chevrolet Volt, GM's plug-in electric car, and would begin retooling the Detroit Hamtramck plant. As events unfolded during the next 2 years, GM ceased production of the Hummer, but rolled out the Volt in the fall of 2010. GM spent billions of dollars developing the Volt and retooling its production facilities to manufacture it. Where did all that money come from? Some of it came from GM profits, but a lot of it came from ordinary folks like you and like me. This lecture is about the connection between saving and investment, between decisions made every day by ordinary folk like you and I to put aside some of what we earn for future use, and, on the other hand, decisions by entrepreneurs and managers of firms to create new capital, such as the capital needed to produce an electric automobile. Along the way, we're going to do what economists often like to do. We're going to take a look at some data that describes saving behavior in the United States and elsewhere. For most of the last 25 years, Americans have saved a very small fraction of their income. But there may be a change underway. One of the side effects of the Great Recession and the subprime mortgage crisis has been a change in the saving behavior of American households. U.S. households are saving more now than they have in the past. Now, an increase in saving is typical during a recession, but preliminary evidence suggests that the increased savings rate may continue after the recession ends. At this point, you're naturally asking, what's the connection between the Chevy Volt and saving behavior of the American household? Well, as we will see, the connection is very, very important, and we need to understand it. While I will look at this connection in great detail, let me say at the outset that it's simply fair to say that saving makes investment possible. If there were no saving, there would be no investment. No new products like the Volt, no technological advances in the workplace, and no growth in the U.S. economy or in the productivity of the American worker. And that is important to everyone. It is growth in the productivity of the American worker, which over the last 75 years has allowed our households to raise their standard of living. While those of us who put aside a few dollars every month for future plans and dreams have our eyes fixed on our own goals, taken together, our savings decisions make the Chevy Volt possible. Without us, no Volt. Well, the very first thing I need to do is to make very clear what I mean and what I do not mean by the word investment. That's very important, both what I mean and what I don't. When used by an economist, investment means the value of increases to the nation's capital stock. What's that? Well, a nation's capital stock is its factories, equipment, computers, and other durable goods used as part of the production process. A nation's capital also includes human capital, training, education, and the skills of the nation's workforce. Many people use the term investment to describe the purchase of stocks and bonds and other financial products that they purchase as part of a financial plan. I will call those kinds of activities financial investment to distinguish them from the economic activity that increases the nation's capital stock. Okay? So I will use the term investment, plain and simple, only to refer to increases in the nation's capital stock. But I'm going to defend my decision. And a simple example helps me get that done, because it explains why it's important to recognize the difference between investment and financial investment. Every day, millions of dollars worth of shares in General Motors are sold on the New York Stock Exchange. However, the ability of General Motors to retool its plant at Hamtramck is unaffected by these sales of GM shares. You're surprised. You should be. But the reason is that almost all of those sales are what I call Peter Paul transactions, from which GM derives no funds. Peter sells the share to Paul. Paul sells it to Jan. Jan sells it to Fred. Both Peter and Paul would describe their purchases and sales of GM stock as part of their investment strategy, but GM derives no direct benefit from the sale of those shares from Peter to Paul. Now, the value of GM shares in the marketplace is certainly important to General Motors. A rise in share prices indicates market approval of decisions made by General Motors. And that's a good thing for GM, for its managers, and for its workers. But a rise in the price of shares of General Motors does not, in and of itself, provide GM with the additional dollars that it can use to retool or for any other purpose. Okay, having defined investment, I naturally want to talk about how large it is. And I want to do that by showing you data for two very different years, 2006 and 2009. In the first year, the U.S. economy was operating very near full employment. Workers were fully employed, plants were working at capacity. But in 2009, as we all remember, the story was very, very different because the U.S. was mired in the midst of a serious recession. And investment data for these 2 years is very, very different. Let's think about 2006 first. Investment in 2006 was $2,327 billion. Gross domestic product, the measure of the total production of the United States, was $13 trillion, just under $400 billion. And so, as a fraction of GDP, investment was 17.4%. 17.4%. In 2009, investment was only $1,589 billion. GDP was slightly higher, $14,119 billion. That ratio, the share of investment in our GDP, had fallen to 11.3%. Can we make sense of this? Sure. In 2006, the United States was growing, and investment accounted for a little over 17% of every dollar's worth of goods we produced. To explain that, just say that every dollar's worth of goods produced in the United States had about 17% dedicated to the creation of new capital. In 2009, on the other hand, because the U.S. was mired in the midst of a serious recession, investment had fallen to only 11.3% of the United States gross domestic product. This lower share of GDP going to investment was a serious indication of pessimism, the pessimism that business decision makers experienced about the near-term prospects of the United States. After all, if you think that the economy will stay in recession, you may, as a firm manager, not think it's the right time to invest in new tools and buildings, not the right time to grow your firm. Why this preoccupation with investment, with growth in the capital stock? Well, economists care about investment because they know that investment is an important contributor to economic growth. There's a very strong relationship between a nation's capital stock, which is a cumulative measure of all past investment activity, and economic growth, which makes it possible for citizens to consume more and higher goods. If we were to look at data across different countries, we would see a very strong positive relationship between a nation's capital stock and its productivity. Simply put, nations with more capital are more productive. This just makes sense. It means simply that a nation where workers have access to more and better tools is a nation where workers are more productive. That's not surprising. And this is not simply a size effect. It's not simply a result driven by the fact that big economies are different from small economies. The data I have looked at controls for the size of an economy by measuring capital on one hand as a fraction of gross domestic product, and productivity on the other hand as output per worker. So I correct for size and nevertheless find this strong positive relationship between capital and productivity. Bottom line? The bottom line is that investment in new buildings, new technologies, new equipment, new information makes nations more productive and increases our national growth rate. You should not find this surprising. An economy where the typical worker has more and better tools is an economy where that worker will produce more. Another example. In some economies, we know that stevedores unload cargo vessels by hand. In others, stevedores use winches, pallet trucks, and a variety of other cargo equipment. You're not surprised that the equipment makes a difference and that stevedores who use it move cargo faster. In economic terms, those folks are just more productive. I talked about saving being necessary for investment, and it now falls to me to explain what I mean by savings. Saving is the difference between some decision makers' income and the decision maker's consumption. Our economy saves when some household, some business, or some sector of government consumes less than the income that that sector earns. Some examples. Let's look at households first. The Jones family earned after-tax income, let's say, of $90,000. In the same year, the Joneses spent $85,000 on food, clothing, rent, fuel, and other consumer goods. We would say, economists would say, that the Jones family saved $5,000 or 5.5% of what it earned. Perhaps this is not the way you think of the saving in your household. Why not? Well, you may think about increasing the value of the assets you own. For example, your retirement portfolio as part of your saving. But this is a case where a valid point of view for one is not a valid point of view for all. It may be completely sensible for you to count your capital gains for the increases in the value of your retirement portfolio when you consider your saving plans. But the economy as a whole cannot do that. The economy as a whole, as we shall see, only has funds for investment if households and other sectors save in the traditional way by spending less than their income. Let's do another example. What would it mean for a business to save? Let's create a business. Frank's Espresso Bar and Cafe has yearly after-tax profits of $150,000. Frank has decided to use $50,000 of those profits to purchase new kitchen equipment and the remainder to pay off some of the loans he obtained to start the company. Frank's saving is $150,000. It does not matter whether the business is using its saving to buy new capital equipment itself or to lower its debt. Both actions constitute savings. Both actions will lead to investment, whether Frank undertakes it or whether someone else does. And finally, one more example. The city of Wtdta, North Carolina, that really is a city called Wtdta in North Carolina. We have some great names for cities in the state of North Carolina. The city of Wtdta, North Carolina has revenues from city fees and sales taxes of, let's say, $1.6 million and expenditures of $1.5 million in its most recent fiscal year. Wtdta has decided to add the remaining $100,000 to the town's rainy day fund. The town of Wtdta is saving and making investment possible. So, with those clarifications and those explanations about what investment is and what savings means, it's now time to think about the connection between saving and investment. One reason that economists try very, very hard to understand the motives that lead various decision makers to save is the simple reason that for the economy as a whole, saving makes investment possible. It would be easy to miss the importance of what I just said, so let me put it a different way. Without saving in an economy, there can be no investment. Without saving, there can be no growth. The amount of investment spending that an economy can undertake in a given period of time equals the sum of saving by firms, households, and governments in that economy, plus any borrowing that economy is able to do from other economies in the rest of the world. I've said that several times. It's so important. But now let me unpack the statement and provide you some intuition. Every time we produce $1's worth of goods in the United States, we generate $1's worth of income for someone. For the economy as a whole, total income in a year is just sufficient to purchase all the goods that we produce. If every member of the economy, everyone who received income, spent all of the income they received on consumer goods and consumer services, there wouldn't be anything left over. In that kind of a world where no one saved, where everybody spent all of their income on consumer goods, all of GDP would be consumed. Our accounts would change. Our industries would change. We would have nothing but manufacturers of consumer goods. The only way that our economy can release resources for the production of investment goods is if consumers and firms and government entities spend less than their income on those consumer goods and services. That means that the only way that we can have investment, that we can have plants that focus on the production of investment goods is that if some households, some firms, and some components of government release funds to them, release productive capacity to those plants and firms that produce capital goods. When households add funds to their 401k accounts, they are saving, or if you're like, financially investing, but I'm going to say saving. But the act of adding to a 401k account does not in and of itself add productive capital. What it does is release funds for the production of capital. The data show again how this limitation, and by that I mean how savings limits investment, works. And I'm again going to consider data for two very different years. Let's think of 2007 first. In 2007, households saved $178.9 billion. Firms saved more, $316 billion. Our federal government, because it was running a deficit even back in 2007, saved negative $236.5 billion. So it ate into the total, right? It used up some of the savings by households and firms. State and local governments ran surpluses and saved, but pretty small amounts. The total saving for the United States in that year of 2007, $280.2 billion. What was the investment that year? $990 billion. How did we make that work? In 2007, we borrowed a lot of money from the rest of the world. We borrowed over $725 billion from people outside the United States. 2009, not surprisingly, was a very different year. As I already mentioned, household savings went up. Indeed, it more than doubled to $458.6 billion. Not surprising here. Households were feeling that they needed to hedge additional risks, and so they saved. Firms felt the same way, and they increased their saving, $423.4 billion. So you're saying, great news, right? We're going to make more investment possible. Maybe that's how we'll get out of this recession. Oh, sorry. The federal government's deficit increased from $236 billion in 2007 to $1,226.5 billion in 2009. The federal government more than used up the savings provided by the household and firm sector. State and local governments, not surprisingly, ran deficits as well, but again, these were quite small. What was the total amount of saving in the United States? Negative $363 billion. Whoa! What does that mean? Did we have to eat up our capital? Did we, to finance that? No. Our investment fell to a very, very small amount, about a quarter of what it was in 2007, but $278 billion. And we financed the difference by, again, borrowing from abroad. In the future, I'm going to talk to you a lot about this borrowing from abroad that we've been doing. But today, I'm simply going to set that aside, and I'm going to notice here and point out to you for emphasis that investment is limited to the savings we do and the funds we can borrow from abroad. And I'm going to emphasize that the reason that is true is that investment is the production of something, of capital goods. And we either have to release resources in the United States or borrow those resources from somewhere else in the world in order to build that capital. Now, these data are from the Federal Reserve flow of funds accounts, and if you do the math, if you do the arithmetic, you'll notice that total saving plus foreign borrowing does not exactly add up to investment. There are statistical discrepancies. These are hard things to measure in a complicated economy like ours. Typically, the data are revised, so you'd find the discrepancy is smaller for 2007 when the data have been revised, and larger for 2009 when that revision is not yet complete. Savings rates have varied a lot in the United States in the last 25 years. Again, I'd like to take a look at some data with you. Between 1993 and 2005, the household saving rate in the United States fell until it reached a low point of less than 2%. While the gross saving rate oscillated, it remained above 14% until 2006, and then it began to fall. And it fell more rapidly during the Great Recession until it reached a 20-year low of just over 10%. So when you look at these data, you would say that as a nation, we are at our lowest gross savings point in the last 25 years. Investors compete with households and and government entities for funds. Federal government deficits use up saving that could be used for investment. Thus, government deficits curtail growth. That's one of the reasons that we care a lot about them. Government deficits use up our savings that could be used to build capital. We borrow from foreign nations when we run a trade deficit, different from a fiscal deficit, because a trade deficit means that the rest of the world allows us to borrow their productive capacity by sending to us a volume of goods and services of greater value than the goods and services we send back to them. It's like they're lending us goods and services. Foreign borrowing allows investment to be larger than it would have been, but foreign nations expect to eventually be paid back in goods and services, meaning that someplace, at some time, we will have to run negative trade deficits in order to pay back these nations that have lent us funds. How has U.S. investment fared over time? Well, the chart shows private gross domestic investment in the United States as a share of GDP from 1947 to 2010. What you see is that if you were to compute an average, that average would be about 16%. So on average over this period, we have committed about 16% of our gross domestic product to investment. But it also shows that our investment fell dramatically to the lowest point in the entire graph during the Great Recession. And that makes that recession very special. You can see other decreases, you can see other troughs, but no trough deeper than the trough associated with the Great Recession depicted in the final years that the graph shows. Household savings differ across countries. The graph that you're looking at now shows household savings rates for a number of countries in 2010, just to illustrate. Savings rates vary a great deal, with households in some nations saving as much as 12% of household income, and others saving very little. The nations with the highest saving rates were Belgium, 12%, Germany, 11.5%, Ireland, 11%, Sweden, 10.2%, and Switzerland, 10.5%. The nations with the lowest savings rate were the Czech Republic at 1% and Denmark at -1%. Now, I know that makes you curious. The negative saving rate in Denmark meant that the Danish households consumed more than their income. That was possible because those households borrowed. As all taken together, they borrowed to finance their extra consumption. So they ate into the savings by Danish firms and Danish government. Why would Danish households do negative saving? Research suggests that Danish households consume more than their income in response to a large increase in the price of the house, the typical house in Denmark, that occurred after financial markets in Denmark were liberalized. Danish households felt richer and spent some of their perceived wealth increase immediately. Again, for the individual households, when you feel wealthier, you don't save in traditional ways. You may try to spend part of your wealth. Denmark is not unique. Changes in the price of assets held by U.S. households are frequently cited as one of the explanations for changes in savings in the United States. Indeed, as house prices in the United States fell, it's natural to expect that traditional savings in the U.S. would have increased. The U.S. saving rate for the U.S. in 2010 was 5.7%, which was much higher than it had been prior to the Great Recession, in part because low value of U.S. houses had made individuals look to traditional saving sources in order to meet their retirement goals. Low household savings rates in the United States that are enforced by large government budget deficits imply that the U.S. faces an unpleasant choice. It can borrow from the rest of the world in order to engage in investment projects. It can allow investment to fall as a fraction of GDP, implying that growth in the United States will fall and standard of living will eventually fall. No other alternative is possible because, as a nation, investment must equal the sum of savings by households, savings by businesses, and borrowing from other nations. We end this lecture as we began it, by considering the silver lining in the cloudy sky of the Great Recession. One legacy of the Great Recession may turn out to be that American households rediscover the virtues of saving. American consumers had come to believe that growth in the value of their homes provided a dependable source of wealth for growth in the future, and led them to do less of traditional saving. The bursting of the housing bubble in 2007 may have taught American households that to provide for their futures, they must return to traditional forms of saving, setting aside something from every paycheck.
Lecture 9. The Real Rate of Interest.
In September 1978, nominal interest rates were very high. For example, the one-year Treasury bond rate was 8.6%, and it was on the way up. Rates paid by private borrowers were higher, but they moved together with the Treasury bond rate. The one-year Treasury bond rate would continue to rise until it peaked at over 16% in August 1981. Then, the T-bond rate and rates generally would begin to fall. On the way back down, the one-year Treasury bond rate would again hit 8.6% in January of 1983. So you might ask, what's the point? What is the significance of the simple fact that the one-year Treasury bond rate was 8.6% in September 78 and then 8.6% again in January 1983? These apparently straightforward numbers embody a fascinating and perplexing puzzle. But why? Why are they puzzling? Because in a very important sense, that is the point of this lecture, it was much more expensive to borrow in January of 1983 than it was to borrow in September of 1978. How can that be? How could this be so? The nominal rates of interest were the same in those 2 months. I can hear you screaming it to me. But the key to resolving this puzzle involves a concept called the real rate of interest. What the real rate of interest is, how to think about it, and why it is the correct way to measure the cost of borrowing is the subject of this lecture. By the end of this lecture, you are likely to think in a different way than ever before about the true cost of borrowing. The real rate of interest is one of those economic concepts that has the power to change the way all of us look at the world. Let's begin on familiar ground with what economists call the nominal rate of interest, what we all think of as the rate of interest. The nominal rate of interest is what we think about when we think of an interest rate. The nominal rate of interest is typically expressed as a percentage, 5%, 6%, 7%, but in fact, it specifies the number of dollars that a borrower must pay to borrow funds. If the nominal rate is 10%, a person who borrows $1,000 for 1 year on January 2nd must pay back $1,100 on January 2nd of the following year, $1,000 in principal and 10% of that, $100 in interest. By the same token, a person who lends $1,000 for 1 year at 10% will give up $1,000 on January 2nd and receive in return $1,100 on January 2nd, 1 year later. Why does the borrower pay interest, and why does the lender receive interest? The simple reason is that the lender gives up something of value to the borrower. In our example, the right to use $1,000 1 year earlier. Suppose Joe is just making ends meet, but suddenly discovers that his automobile needs a major repair. Joe could wait and save for the repair, but Joe reckons that he cannot function without use of his auto for a whole year. So Joe pays interest and obtains the right to use in the present funds that he will not earn until a year later. Continuing our example, suppose Jan is saving for her daughter's college education. Jan has decided that she prefers purchases that she can make in the future, her daughter's tuition, to purchases that she could make right now. If Jan lends funds to Joe, she will receive a reward for her patience. Now, all of us know that in reality, borrowers typically pay a higher rate of interest than the rate received by savers. The difference is compensation received by financial institutions such as banks that function as go-betweens between the borrowers and the lenders. We'll come back to that issue later in the course, but for now, I'm going to assume that borrowing and lending rates are the same. That will keep our story simple, and it will do absolutely no violence to the points that we're studying today. Now, you and I may think that the payment of interest when we borrow and the receipt of interest when we save is the most natural thing in the world. But it's interesting that in some cultures, and according to some religious codes, the payment of interest is wrong. The view that collection of interest on a debt is somehow wrong or even immoral can be traced to the Greek philosopher Aristotle, who argued that money does not produce anything, and therefore borrowing money should not cost anything. Now, Aristotle thought that someone who used another person's land should pay rent for the land because the person who borrowed the land could use the land to grow a crop. But Aristotle argued that money was not like land, and that ideally people should not collect interest from one another. What Aristotle did not acknowledge, and what is of great importance, is that no one borrows money unless he or she intends to use it. Like the land renter, the borrower does receive something of value, the right to purchase goods earlier rather than later, and the opportunity to use funds sooner rather than later is something both valuable and productive. The mutual benefit that borrowers and lenders receive when they transact is a very powerful force, so powerful that it has led practitioners of religions that forbid the collection of interest to find workarounds that allow transactions to go forward but do not technically involve interest payments. Let's think of an example. An Islamic bank approaches home loans and home loan mortgages in a very different way than Western banks do. They do not loan money to the home buyer and then collect interest. That is forbidden. But yet, people who practice Islam wish to buy homes. How does an Islamic bank help them? Well, the Islamic bank buys the home itself and then resells it to the buyer at a profit, while at the same time allowing the buyer to pay for this home purchase in installments. A workaround that, if we thought about it, would implicitly involve interest, but does not explicitly involve interest collection. So, now we know that a borrower receives something of value, the right to use funds earlier rather than later. But what does the borrower give up for that right? And what does the lender receive for agreeing to spend later, to be patient, and to defer spending until the time that the loan is repaid? Interest. You would tell me that I have already said that. Ah, yes, but the number of dollars paid or received in interest is an inaccurate measure of the cost of borrowing and an inaccurate measure of the reward from lending. The right way to describe what the lender receives and what the borrower gives up is with that concept called the real rate of interest. The real rate of interest measures the size of what I'll call a goods bonus that savers receive by agreeing to defer the use of income. It likewise measures the size of a goods penalty that borrowers pay for the right to use their income. Let's return to our example of Joe and Jan. Joe would like to borrow $1,000 from Jan at 10% interest to fix his car. Jan would like to lend $1,000 to Joe at 10% interest because she is saving for her daughter's college education. Consider the year that starts on the day that Joe borrowed $1,000 and ends on the day that he repays the loan. Suppose during that year, prices rise by 6%. Which prices? Well, rather than get bogged down in describing exactly what Joe and Jan consume, let's simply say that they consume the typical bushel basket, and that the consumer price index, which rises by 6%, is a measure of the inflation that they face. When Joe repays the loan, he repays with dollars that have lost 6% of their purchasing power relative to the dollars that he borrowed. That is, the dollars that he borrowed at the beginning of the year could purchase 6% more than the dollars that he repaid at the end of the year. Similarly, at the time of repayment, Jan receives dollars that can purchase 6% less than the dollars she lent. So a good estimate of the goods penalty that Joe pays by borrowing is 4%. The nominal rate of interest of 10% minus the inflation rate during the period of the loan. And a good estimate of the goods bonus that Jan receives is likewise 4%, 10 minus 6. Okay, computation of the real rate of interest then involves adjusting the nominal rate of interest for the rate of inflation during the period of the loan, during the time between borrowing and repayment. There is a subtle and somewhat difficult issue that we must address, however. At the time that Joe and Jan make their arrangement, they do not know what the rate of inflation will turn out to be. And I'm going to return to that point in just a couple of minutes. Now, data show that the nominal rate of interest rises and falls with the inflation rate and varies more than does the real rate of interest. The chart that you are seeing tracks the one-year Treasury bond rate and the rate of CPI inflation over 50 years between 1960 and 2010. The nominal rate of interest is in blue and the rate of inflation is in red. What you see here is that the nominal rate of interest largely rises and falls with the rate of inflation. They move together through time. We observe that the blue and red lines rise together and fall together, but they are not moving in lockstep. There are times when the inflation rate falls by more than the nominal interest rate, or times when it falls by less. So what does that mean? Let's zoom in to see the data for the years between 1978 and 1983. Why would we want to do that? Well, remember our puzzle at the beginning of the lecture. When we zoom in, we see a diagram with two black vertical lines. And why? Well, those lines mark September 1978 and January 1983. Comparison of the blue interest rate line and the red inflation rate line takes us a long way toward resolving the puzzle that the lecture started with. In September 1978, the inflation rate was almost as high as the interest rate. Well, wait a minute. That makes the real rate of interest very, very small. But in dramatic contrast, in January of 1983, the nominal rate of interest was about 5 full percentage points higher than the inflation rate, which makes the real rate of interest very high. The real rate of interest is defined as the nominal interest rate minus the rate of inflation expected on average over the life of the loan. The graph that we just saw compares nominal interest rates and inflation rates at the same date. Another subtle point, though, that comparison is not quite right. Borrowers and lenders both care about what happens to the purchasing power of the dollars they borrow and lend over the life of the loan. The correct inflation rate to use is not known at the time that the loan is consummated. Both borrowers and lenders must guess the future course of inflation in order to estimate the real rate of interest and the true cost of borrowing and the true cost of lending. The next graph shows the real rate of interest between 1978 and 1983, assuming that borrowers and lenders had guessed the inflation rate correctly. It's sort of a crystal ball exercise. What if they had known in advance exactly what the inflation rate would be? Now, technically speaking, the graph shows for each month the 1-year nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate that was realized over the year of the loan. That inflation rate is computed as the percentage change in the consumer price index that occurred between the date the loan was initiated and the date the loan was repaid. What we see in this diagram is that the real rate of interest was actually negative between 1978 and 1980 because inflation turned out to be higher than individuals expected when they agreed to the terms of the loan. Beginning in 1980, nominal interest rates caught up and surpassed the inflation rate, and the real rate of interest began to rise until it peaked at just under 12% in 1981. We now understand how to resolve the puzzle presented at the beginning of the lecture. It would turn out that the real rate of interest was minus 3.5% for September 1978, but 4.4% for January 1983. The difference is a large, I would say a whopping 7.9%. How can individuals estimate the future inflation rate and thereby estimate the real rate of interest at the point of a decision to borrow and lend? Well, any such estimate is just that. It's an estimate. So the real rate of interest can never be known for sure at the time that borrowing and lending decisions are made. One way to understand why the real rate of interest was negative between January 1978 and September of 1979 is to observe that the inflation rate was rising over this period. Had individuals known that the inflation rate would rise, they would surely have sought and received a higher nominal rate on their loans. Now, there is a cautionary tale here. We have talked about the importance of a low and stable inflation rate in previous lectures. One reason that low and stable inflation rates are so important is because when the inflation rate is low and stable, it is easier to forecast. When the inflation rate is low and stable, it is harder for borrowers and lenders to make mistakes. When the inflation rate is low and stable, we do not end up by fooling our lenders to actually accept a negative real rate of interest, a negative premium or goods bonus for lending their funds. And of course, if those lenders are people who are lending now in order to save for their retirement, it's very, very crucial to understand why being fooled is very important to those savers and lenders. When the real rate of interest is negative, they are actually receiving a negative return on their funds. That is, they are actually losing the ability to buy goods and services. That's serious business. Now, we don't have a crystal ball. We cannot forecast the inflation rate perfectly, and there are before-the-fact estimates of future inflation that are available. The Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia surveys business persons and asks them for their inflation forecasts. The next chart gives forecasts of CPI inflation since 1981. We can see from the graph that inflation forecasts were falling in the months before January of 1983. And as the first graph shows, it turned out that those forecasts were correct. CPI inflation did fall during that period. It's not important for us at this point to ask how accurate those forecasts are. What is important is for us to continue to emphasize the distinction between nominal and real interest rates, and to emphasize why that distinction is important. To understand the importance of real interest rates, it is sufficient to remember Jan's problem. Recall, Jan wants to save for her daughter's college education. Suppose Jan ignores inflation and bases her saving decisions on the nominal rate alone. By making that mistake, Jan ignores the likely increases in tuition that will occur between the present and the time that her daughter matriculates. And of course, that is a potentially disastrous mistake to make. By using the real rate of interest in her savings calculations, Jan is using forecasts of CPI inflation as a proxy for changes in tuition. The forecasts can turn out to be imperfect, but it's far better to assume that tuition costs would rise along with the consumer price index than to assume that no increases in tuition costs would occur. Understanding the concept of the real rate of interest conveys an additional benefit to us all. It also helps us better understand why it is crucial for the Federal Reserve to keep inflation rates low and steady. If the Federal Reserve keeps inflation low and steady, it is far easier for borrowers and for lenders to estimate the real rate of interest at the point in which they make their credit transactions. That means if I can depend on the Federal Reserve keeping the inflation rate at 2%, I can personally be guaranteed when I can earn, say, 4% on very long-term savings vehicles, that I will actually receive a goods bonus. That's an extremely valuable piece of information to have and helps me plan so much better for the future. It also means that we will be unlikely to see again the puzzling situation that we saw at the beginning of today's lecture. Think of how damaging that was. In the late 1970s, individuals were willingly loaning their money, and it would turn out that the rate of inflation was accelerating so rapidly that they actually received, when they were repaid by the Treasury or by private borrowers, dollars that would buy less than the dollars they lent. What kind of a bonus is that? What kind of an incentive is that to save, to actually receive fewer goods and services a year or 2 or 5 later than the goods and services that you gave up when you agreed to let someone else use your funds? Of course, it was a windfall for borrowers. A windfall. They actually paid back dollars that had less value than the dollars they borrowed. That's hardly giving up anything. Now we understand, perhaps better, why our founding fathers were so worried about inflation. They understood that inflation was a scheme that would transfer wealth from creditors to debtors. We can understand also why, as we will see in coming lectures, most of us, and certainly all economists, believe that keeping the inflation rate low and steady is an essential goal for monetary policy. Keeping the inflation rate low and steady is an essential goal of monetary policy for the very, very simple reason that we want borrowers and lenders to understand what the real interest rate will be over not a year, not 2 years, not 5 years, but perhaps as long as 10 years. We want individuals to know when they contract what they actually are receiving in interest and what they are actually paying in interest. When people have that knowledge, when they can be confident about that knowledge, they are able to plan better, more efficiently, and the economy in all of its aspects is better off as a result. So, I promised you a concept that would change the way that you look at economic issues. Please, always remember that the true cost of borrowing and the true benefit from saving is measured properly by the real rate of interest. It's the most important concept that I have offered you today, and it's probably one of my top 5 for the entire course. Remember, too, what the real rate of interest means. It's the actual nominal rate, which tells you what dollars you will receive, adjusted for the inflation that you believe you will experience over the course of the loan. Don't forget that very important concept. And thank you.
Lecture 10, Financial Intermediaries.
Many people, and perhaps you're one of them, believe that it is very smart to cut out the middleman. They argue, wouldn't it be great to swap houses with someone and avoid those pesky real estate fees, which can eat up between 5 and 10% of property value? All of us, I know I have heard advertising pitches telling us to shop at a warehouse store and cut out the middleman. Many of us believe that middlemen, such as real estate agents, absorb our hard-earning money without producing anything. In this lecture, we will look at the role of financial middlemen and think about whether or not they play an important role in a modern economy. But don't be too quick to agree that it's smart to cut out the middleman. Imagine, just for example, how much time it would take you to manage your own portfolio of stocks if there were no mutual funds? You wouldn't be able to buy a little bit of a lot of shares because the minimum purchase is one share. Contemplate the stress you would feel as you, at the early times when your portfolio was small, had to choose the one or two or three different stocks that you could afford to purchase. Imagine how difficult it would be to arrange to borrow funds to purchase a home without the services of a bank or a thrift institution, a savings and loan. Okay, maybe Uncle Joe would lend you the funds. I should have such an Uncle Joe. But sooner or later, and maybe sooner than you're ready for it, Uncle Joe would want the money he lent you back, certainly when he neared retirement. And then what would you do? Imagine how difficult it would be for you to provide for your family in the event of your death if you didn't have access to an insurance company and the insurance policies that they offer. What might you do? Well, perhaps you'd make some sort of an agreement with extended family members to care for one another's immediate family in the event of a calamity. That's certainly what happened in my father's time. But if you think about it, that agreement would be essentially the formation of a primitive insurance company. In today's lecture, we'll take a close look at an important group of middlemen, financial intermediaries. Financial intermediaries are firms, including banks, that channel funds from savers to investors and from savers to other decision makers who have decided to spend more than their current income permits. Now, my talk today is not about the wisdom of spending beyond your means or when it is wise to spend beyond your means and when it is not. I'm going to assume that those decisions to borrow are rational, well-founded, and right for the decision makers who make them. Later on, we can talk about when borrowing is wise and when it is not. Okay, so we are talking about people who borrow and other people who lend. Some financial transactions are going to occur directly without the intervention of a financial firm. Remember Joe and Jan from the previous lecture? Joe would like to borrow $1,000 to repair his car. He's willing to pay, say, 6% and to repay principal and interest in 1 year. Jan has decided to save for her daughter's college education, and she's willing to lend $1,000 for 1 year at 6% interest. Joe and Jan, if they know each other, have the opportunity to make a mutually beneficial transaction. Joe will be better off. He gets the money to repair his car. Jan will be better off. She will be earning some interest that helps her better pay for her daughter's tuition. In the transaction between them, Joe will receive $1,000 now, and he will give his IOU, and that IOU will promise to pay $1,060 in 1 year. Jan will give $1,000 now, give it to Joe in cash, say, and she will receive that promissory note from Joe, and both are better off. But here's the rub. How did Joe and Jan find each other? And how comfortable will Jan be trusting Joe? After all, she's taking a risk. For example, Joe's bad luck could continue. His car might require additional repairs, or other things might happen. And the result could be that Joe might not be able to repay. And then Jan might not have enough to pay her daughter's tuition. Most financial transactions involve a financial intermediary, such as a commercial bank, thrift institution, investment bank, or some other. Now, I want to take a look at a picture that will help us understand what these middlemen do. We have a lender and a borrower, and their handshake sends cash from the lender to the borrower. And what travels in the reverse direction is the borrower's promise to pay, which I call the borrower's IOU. Contrast that with the flow diagram, which is meant to show what happens when borrower and lender use the services of a financial intermediary. Okay. Lender sends cash not to borrower, but to the financial intermediary. And we'll see how that works when we become more specific in a minute. It's the financial intermediary who takes the cash they have received and then provides it to the borrower. Pretty simple. What's a little more subtle is the reverse transaction. The borrower, just like Joe, provides his promise to pay his IOU, not to Jan, but to the financial intermediary, the bank or the thrift institution. And the financial intermediary, the middleman, does not simply pass it on to Jan or some other lender. What is passed on is the financial intermediary's own IOU. What the lender gets in exchange is the financial intermediary's promise to repay. It follows then that we can view financial intermediaries as repackaging the IOUs of its borrowers. And many lenders prefer exchanging their cash for repackaged IOUs than exchanging their cash for the IOUs of specific borrowers. But why? Lenders prefer to hold a diversified portfolio of IOUs because they dislike risk and do not want to put all of their eggs, or for that matter, all of their dollars, into one basket. An example will help. So suppose that there are 1,000 lenders who each wish to lend $1,000, and there are 1,000 borrowers who each wish to borrow $1,000. I know those are made-up numbers, but they help illustrate the point. With direct finance and the use of no middleman, best we could do is to have the borrowers and the lenders pair up. I don't know how they find each other, but suppose they do. Well, if, say, 5% of the borrowers experience bad luck and cannot repay, then 5% of those 1,000 lenders lose interest in their entire principal. So there are 5% of those people who are greatly harmed. On the other hand, with indirect finance, there is never any pairing of borrower and lender. Each borrower holds an IOU issued by the financial intermediary. That IOU is, in turn, backed by the whole portfolio of borrower IOUs. Why is that important? Because the financial intermediary will charge borrowers a high enough interest rate to allow for the expected number of defaults, individual lenders will all be paid in full by the intermediary. A loan to the intermediary by someone like Jan is less risky because, in effect, each lender holds a diversified portfolio of IOUs. Evidence of that is the lenders do not even know who is benefiting from the fact that they provided funds. They don't know the name of the person who ultimately got them. Now, we all know that diversification is valuable. What we may not have realized before is that financial intermediaries provide diversification not only in the case of mutual funds, but also in the case of borrowing and lenders. Here's another example of repackaging, which I consider to be very important. In fact, I think you're going to find this one absolutely fascinating. Borrowers and lenders have different time horizons. What do I mean? Well, the borrower may want to borrow for a certain number of years, and the lender may want to lend for a different number of years. So suppose again that there are 1,000 lenders who each want to lend 1,000 for 1 year. But to keep things simple, suppose there are also 1,000 borrowers, each of whom wants to borrow $1,000. Just like before, right? Now, here's the rub. Suppose that the borrowers want to borrow for 2 years, while the lenders want to lend for only 1. Stylized example, right? I mean, clearly borrowers might want to borrow for 5 years, 10 years, 30 years, and lenders might want to lend for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. But we'll just make it that the lenders want to lend for 1 and the borrowers want to borrow for 2. Direct finance breaks down entirely now. There is just no mutually beneficial transaction that can be made between any borrower-lender pair. Pick any one of the 1,000 borrowers, any one of the 1,000 lenders, put them together and say, make a deal. They can't make a deal. They do not have mutually advantageous basis for making a deal. Aha! Enter the middleman, because indirect finance can bring those borrowers and lenders together. It's almost like magic. What would they do? Well, the financial intermediary can lend funds for 2 years and borrow funds for 1, provided that after 1 year, it just goes out and replaces those old lenders who want their funds back with new lenders. In short, at the time that they give the funds to the borrower, they don't even know who will provide the funds for the second year. The financial intermediary in this case finds a sequence of 1-year lenders who collectively provide the funds desired by the multi-year borrower. Some financial firms specialize in this kind of maturity intermediation, and they bear some risks when they do. There are not many lenders who want to lend for 30 years, a few insurance companies, but that's about it. Lenders may be more willing to lend if they know that they can quickly and without loss reconvert the IOUs that they have to cash. Wait a minute. What does that mean? Well, I'm talking about a third sort of repackaging here. And it involves a new idea called liquidity. A financial asset is said to be liquid if it can rapidly be converted to cash with no loss of value. Lenders value liquidity because liquid funds are available to the lender if some rainy day scenario occurs. Jan would be even more willing to lend if she knew that she could trade that IOU in for cash if her own auto requires a repair, for example. So if she thought somehow that the Joe IOU that she held could be converted to cash, say, in 6 months, she would be more comforted and more willing to lend. Financial intermediaries create liquidity. That is, they offer lenders IOUs that are more liquid than the IOUs that the borrowers exchange for the cash they receive. Whoa, that's a mindful. Let's think about that for a moment. Financial intermediaries offer the lenders an asset with the promise that it's convertible to cash. But those financial intermediaries don't receive that kind of asset from the people to whom they lend funds. Now, how do financial intermediaries create liquidity? Well, they do so by holding some cash in reserve. The intermediary does not know in advance which lender will want to reconvert to cash, but it probably can make a very shrewd guess about how much cash will be desired by the lenders as a group. And by holding sufficient reserves for the group, each and every lender can rationally behave as if all of them could convert their IOUs to cash, even though it will turn out that few will actually do so. This is just an amazing cooperative outcome that we can all think, for example, of our bank deposits as fully liquid. Okay. One more service that financial intermediaries offer their customers is specialization in the evaluation of borrowers and their projects, and better assessment of the riskiness of any borrower that then could be made by an individual lender. Just imagine for a minute that 1,000 pairings, those 1,000 borrowers and lenders. Put Fred together with Fredo. How will Fred know enough about Fredo to know whether he is likely to be repaid? Banks specialize in assessing the creditworthiness of lenders. A financial intermediary evaluates many loan applications and develops specialized processes for evaluating them and monitoring them. A financial intermediary employs specialized legal skills that it uses to design and enforce borrowing contracts. This is very, very important. In a later lecture, we'll look at those contracts. And government provides oversight of financial intermediaries and, in some cases, special assistance to them, which further protects individuals who lend them funds. That assistance, that government assistance, is not available to people who go it alone, who engage in direct finance. Commercial banks are financial intermediaries that also provide their customers with transaction services. Your deposits can be used to pay bills. And many customers prefer to hold their liquid funds as bank deposits because it's easy to pay them out by writing checks or, today, by authorizing electronic transfers. Now, we will zero in on that particular intermediary, the commercial bank, in a future lecture. Okay. A comparison of different financial intermediaries shows how each specializes in the provision of intermediation services. So I've talked up till now about the various repackaging services that intermediaries offer, but I haven't differentiated between the actual types of financial firms. Okay? And now I would like to do so that you can appreciate how each different kind of financial middleman plays its role in the financial world. Let's start with commercial banks. What do? Well, commercial banks accept deposits from households and from businesses and each of those depositors, the firms and the households, treat those deposits as transaction balances that they can spend at any time. Okay? Liquidity. Banks typically hold about 10% of those deposits in the form of cash and use that cash when depositors wish to reconvert their deposits back to cash. But commercial banks use the balance of their funds to make business and consumer loans and earn a profit. So, in terms of those repackaging services that I talked about, commercial banks create liquidity, provide diversification to their customers, and are specialists in assessing creditworthiness. And as I mentioned already, assessing creditworthiness is extremely important. You wouldn't imagine for a moment bumping into a stranger and loaning that stranger funds. You would have no idea of the difference between a scam and a good business opportunity. Thrift institutions are slightly different from commercial banks, and they include savings banks and credit unions. Savings and loan associations, when I was young, were also thrift institutions that were very different from and very important, especially in mortgage lending. But as time and law evolved, savings and loans have become less important, and commercial banks also make mortgage loans. But what do these thrift institutions do? Well, they accept depositors' deposits. That is, depositors give them funds. And typically those depositors are people who are willing to defer the use of their funds for some period. And what do they get in return? Well, a higher interest rate typically than they could get from their bank if their deposits were checkable, if they were transactions balances. Okay, so now we have these thrifts receiving funds from depositors and paying interest for them. How do they use the funds? Well, thrifts typically use the funds to make consumer loans and, importantly, mortgage loans. They are the backbone and have been through history in the mortgage lending business. With respect to the repackaging services I've been talking about, what do thrift institutions do? Well, they are specialists at intermediating maturities. They also create diversification because the people who deposit to them are not linked up or paired with any particular mortgage borrower. And they, too, assess the creditworthiness of borrowers, especially mortgage borrowers. Now, we all know about one thrift institution, and we learn again about it in most Christmas seasons, the Bailey Building and Loan. The Bailey Building and Loan was George Bailey's family business, and it is the one that's under threat from banker Potter and is likely to experience a run. And we ought to think about that run for a minute because it includes an important lesson. Any depository institution that borrows short from its customers and lends long always is fragile if all of the depositors coordinate their activities and ask for their money at the same time. I can remember the line in the movie when George Bailey says, upon having one of his depositors demand his entire balance at the Bailey Building Loan, "But Fred, your money isn't here. It's out working to build houses. We used it to build George's houses and Ralph's house." This is another case where we coordinate our activity by using the services of a thrift institution or a financial intermediary in general. And if we suddenly change the nature of this coordination, we cause problems for these institutions. So, what do these thrift institutions do then? As I've already said, their most important repackaging function is to repackage so as to provide intermediation of maturities. They lend long and borrow short. All of us know about mutual funds, okay? That's probably the financial institution that we know the best and value the most. What do mutual funds do? Well, they receive funds from those who would like to buy shares. And which shares? Well, every mutual fund has to create a prospectus saying what their investment strategy is and saying the kind of shares that the fund will buy. Those shares, therefore, are sold along with the mutual fund's promise to use the funds obtained by investors, financial investors, to pursue specific financial objectives. The managers of those mutual funds use the funds they receive from their financial investors to construct a portfolio of assets that they believe will achieve the promised objectives. Now, clearly, mutual funds provide very, very important services to their customers. Diversification and asset management. Remember from the beginning how difficult it would be, especially when you were first starting out to save for retirement, to know what few shares you should purchase? Given the existence of mutual funds, you don't have to make that decision. You can invest a few dollars, maybe as little as $100, and you can, in effect, own a little bit of hundreds and maybe thousands of different corporations. This is a tremendously valuable service that we have long understood and that probably we value the best. But my point today is that other financial intermediaries, other financial middlemen offer very, very valuable services too. Let's take a look at one more financial intermediary, the money market mutual fund. What do they do, and what sort of services do they offer? Well, money market mutual funds receive funds from those who buy shares. But unlike a typical mutual fund, this fund, the money market mutual fund, promises to purchase only assets that are themselves highly liquid, treasury bills, very short-term corporate loan instruments, and the like. If left untouched, if the money market mutual fund made no additional transactions, all of its assets would naturally reconvert to cash within a short period of time, certainly within a year, maybe as little as 90 days. So, what that money market mutual fund has done is to use the funds provided them by their customers to construct a portfolio of very short-term debt instruments. Money market mutual funds create liquidity, but they also provide diversification, and they allow customers to receive some interest on funds that they consider to be pretty liquid. A very interesting story is how money market mutual funds were first created. They were born out of an attempt to work around a government regulation, but that story will come on a different day. The last financial intermediary that I'd like to talk to you about is insurance companies. What do? Well, receive funds from policyholders and provide them with promises to pay in certain contingencies. So, for example, if you were to die, a death benefit would be paid to your family. So these firms use funds to pay claims to policyholders and what do they do with those funds? They make long maturity investments that earn profits to support future claims and cash redemptions. Insurance companies provide policyholders the opportunity to hedge risk by paying a relatively small premium on a regular schedule in exchange for the right to be repaid if some calamity occurs. Financial intermediaries, banks, thrifts, mutual funds, and insurance companies exist because they provide valuable services to their customers. And customers value the service of financial intermediaries. Imagine again how much time it would take you to manage your own portfolio of stocks. Imagine again how better off you are if a deposit at a bank or a thrift institution can be reconverted to cash. And imagine again how much comfort you feel if you can make small payments and in a cooperative way with many others like you, receive in return the opportunity to provide for your family in the event of a calamity. All of those are valuable services, and all of those are the reasons that financial firms exist. So, as I leave you, please reconsider, should we cut out the middleman, Or are they too valuable? Thank you.
Lecture 11, Commercial Banks.
What do you think of when you hear the word bank? If you are like many others, you think of a vault with one of those huge steel vault doors that weighs many tons and requires specially engineered hinges so that it can be swung open. Well, there's a reason that the word bank evokes such an image. There was a time long ago when the primary function of a bank was to store the wealth of its customers. As we saw in an earlier lecture, a precursor of the modern bank was the European goldsmith, who expanded his business from fashioning items out of gold to storing the gold of his customers. Of course, Hollywood has helped promote the image of a bank as a vault. From Mary Poppins to Bonnie and Clyde, a scene with a bank is almost always a scene with an impressive bank vault. Another question for you. What do you think when you hear the word banker? Again, if you are like many, you will think of the famous 19th to 20th century banker J.P. Morgan, who had a reputation as a ruthless businessman. Or perhaps you will think of Lionel Barrymore, the scion of the famous acting family, who played Banker Potter, the adversary of Jimmy Stewart's character, George Bailey, in the Christmas classic movie, It's a Wonderful Life. I'm not an expert in psychology, but let me share an opinion. I think it's likely that the Wall Street versus Main Street metaphor that we encountered earlier was so often used to discuss the subprime financial crisis because it appealed to our society's preconceived notions of banks and of bankers as ruthless businessmen who have no interest in the common man or his concerns or his needs. In today's lecture, we will take a dispassionate look at a bank and the functions it performs in a modern economy. We will learn why banks are the only private financial institutions that can create money. We will investigate bank balance sheets and come to understand the role that banks play in channeling funds from savers to investors. And we will study the process by which banks create money. We will also see how the law, and in particular the Federal Reserve Act, has given an element of control over the process of bank money creation to the Federal Reserve. The first point that we must have clear is that banks are not repositories. In the very first Harry Potter film, Harry is taken to his vault at Gringotts, from which he withdraws a number of coins to buy what he needs for his first year at Hogwarts. In the film, the bank is simply a repository, a place of safekeeping. It's guarded by goblins and, as we later learned, by more ferocious creatures. But it is not a bank in the modern sense. In the United States, the closest thing we have to Gringotts is Fort Knox, our gold repository. But despite what you may have heard or may have believed, Fort Knox is not a bank. A good place to begin studying the modern bank is with a look at its balance sheet. Now, let's think back and recall that a balance sheet is a list of the assets, liabilities, and net worth of a firm or an individual, and in this case it'll be a bank, and that net worth is defined to be the value of a firm's assets minus the value of its liabilities. Therefore, by construction, balance sheets always balance. In this lecture, we are less concerned with any particular bank and more concerned with banks in general. And for that reason, we begin our investigation with a look at the consolidated balance sheet of commercial banks. That is, we lump together all the assets, all the liabilities, and look at the banking system as a whole, at the balance sheet of all our commercial banks taken together. Looking at the T accounts of commercial banks is a lot like paleontology. The numbers we're going to see in the balance sheet are the bones we dig up, and our job is to try to figure out what the ancient animal looked like and how it functioned. The T account depicts the consolidated balance sheet of the commercial banks in the United States at a particular time, the end of December 2005, when the U.S. and world economies were in the midst of an expansion. What do we see? Let's look at the asset side first. The total assets of all the banks taken together was $8,707 billion. Well, let's break down those assets and see what the bank actually owned. Treasury securities. So banks own securities that were issued by the Treasury, and that was $1,134 billion, or about 13% of all the assets. Banks also owned other securities, including securities of some private firms, to the tune of $907 billion, or about 10% of its total assets. Banks made commercial and industrial loans of $1,045 billion, about 12% of its assets. Real estate loans, $2,904 billion, or about 33% of its total assets. Consumer loans, $705 billion, about 8% of total assets. Loans to those who were borrowing to buy securities, to buy stocks and bonds, $262 billion, about 3% of assets. And other sorts of loans, $525 billion, 6% of total assets. Banks also made loans to other banks to the tune of $278 billion, about 3% of total assets. And then we come to an interesting item, cash assets, $311 billion. Only 4% of the $8,707 billion that collectively the banks owned. And we have a rounding out item, other assets to the tune of $636 billion, or 7%. So that's what banks owned. Collectively, what were their liabilities? This is also a very interesting list, but it's somewhat shorter. Collectively, commercial banks had accepted transactions deposits from customers. Customers had deposited funds into the banks. $656 billion, or 8% of the loan of the asset total. Okay, we'll use the asset total for computing percentages here. They also had large time deposits. Now, what are those? Well, some customers of a bank will deposit funds that they agree not to reclaim for a period of time. For that reason, those deposits are called time deposits, and they typically provide the customer with a higher rate of interest. There were $1,418 billion of time deposits held at commercial banks, or about 16% of assets. There are other kinds of assets, other kinds of deposits, $3,657 billion, or about 42% of total assets. As I said before, banks borrow from other banks, and the borrowings from other U.S. banks were $361 billion, or 4% of total assets, and borrowings from all other entities about $1,360 billion. So banks go out and attempt to borrow funds to do their business, and that amounted to 16% of total assets. And other liabilities, about $568 billion, or 7%. Net worth, the difference between assets and liabilities, $687 billion, or about 8%. Okay, that's a lot of numbers, but we would like to understand these numbers using the language of sources of funds and uses of funds. A bank's sources of funds are the places from which it gets the funds it uses to prosecute its business. Where does the bank get the funds that it uses to acquire all these assets? Well, banks accept deposits of several types. Transactions deposits are those against which checks can be written. Non-transaction deposits are deposits in savings accounts from which funds can be withdrawn at any time, and time deposits, which have, as I've already explained, fixed maturity dates. Large denomination time deposits are certificates of deposit in amounts at or over $100,000 that are generally purchased by corporations and other banks. As I've said, banks borrow funds from other banks, from the Federal Reserve, from the Federal Home Loan Bank, and from corporations. In December of 2005, total liabilities of the commercial banks in the United States amounted to slightly more than $8 trillion. How did the banks use the funds that they acquired by accepting those deposits and doing those borrowings? As we've seen, banks hold, to some extent, Treasury securities and other government agency securities, so they hold a bond portfolio. Banks hold, to some extent, bonds and other securities of private corporation. But primarily, banks lend funds to businesses for real estate purchases, to consumers in the form of auto loans and other types of consumer loans, and to those who use the borrowed funds to purchase securities and for some other types of loan activities. Banks hold cash assets of two sorts: actual physical currency in their vaults and deposits at the Federal Reserve. Both are considered cash assets. In December 2005, total assets held by commercial banks amounted to a bit more than $8.7 trillion. In 2005 also, bank net worth equaled $687 billion. What is the relative importance of various sources and uses of bank funds? Despite the fact that banks actively go out and borrow funds, they are still primarily depository institutions, in that 70% of their liabilities are deposits of one sort or another. By the way, it's important to keep track of the fact that it's only transactions deposits against which commercial banks are required to hold reserves, and transactions deposits account for only about 8% of all liabilities. Despite the fact that banks hold various kinds of securities, they are primarily lending institutions, and 62% of their assets are loans of one sort or another. In 2005, banks had net worth or capital equal to 8.6% of their liabilities and about 8% of their assets. Banks and bank regulators have worked hard, especially in recent years, to determine minimal levels of bank capital needed to assure bank safety. Bank capital is a tricky business. The value of bank capital can drop very quickly in bad economic times because the market value of the securities that the bank owns can fall, and more importantly, because the true value of bank loans fall. We'll talk in later lectures about the true value of loans and how changes in that value affect the stability of the banking system. But for now, keep in mind that what is important is to understand that bank capital isn't something physical that's locked in a vault. Bank capital changes when the value of assets changes and falls when the value of assets fall. A related point, and very important one, is to realize that banks are always susceptible to bank runs. Remember again, It's a Wonderful Life. Those are events where depositors all try to withdraw their deposited funds at the same time. Why? In December 2005, commercial bank deposit liabilities totaled $5.7 trillion. And of that, $656 billion were demand deposits. But bank cash assets totaled only $311 billion. Less by far than would be needed to redeem even those deposits that depositors have the right to redeem for cash at any time. In this sense, banks are fragile no matter how well they are managed. Okay. Now that we have a more precise understanding of the assets and liabilities of commercial banks, we are in a position for the first time in this course to define money in a formal way. We've used the term money often. I've talked about how the government, quote unquote, prints money to finance deficits. And now we're actually going to define what is considered to be money in the United States. In particular, we're going to ask and answer the question, which assets in the United States are considered part of the money supply in the United States. I'm going to assure you that the definitions which we use in the United States are pretty much the same as the definitions used by all economies in the world. Our reference point will again be December of 2005. If you have at some time in your life taken a Principles of Economics course, some of the following points may be familiar. But don't worry, I'm not going to dwell on arcane facts. Keep in mind, though, that as we go through the various definitions of money, these various definitions share a common intuition. I like to dwell on that intuition. Money is some asset that its owners rightly believe they can quickly and without loss of value convert to purchasing power. What? Well, let's say it a different way. Money comprises those assets that can be used to buy the goods, services, and other assets that people wish to buy. That's what I meant by purchasing power. But the point's so important that I want to say a few more words in clarification. I wished I owned a painting by Van Gogh. If I owned a painting by Van Gogh, I'd be happy and I'd be wealthy. However, I would never think of a Van Gogh painting as money. It's not a liquid asset. It would be exceedingly difficult to convert it to cash. Think about how difficult. I'd have to determine what its potential value was. I'd have to arrange some way to sell it. I'd have to allow for bids. Oh, it might be a great asset, but it would never be money. It could take me years to convert a Van Gogh to cash. The narrowest definition of money that we use in the United States and other developed nations use as well is what's called M1, capital M, number 1, which equals currency held by the public plus traveler's checks by non-bank issuers, plus demand deposits at commercial banks, and any other checkable deposits. Okay? Well, that's very, very intuitive. Clearly, we can pay with cash, we can pay with our checking accounts, and we can pay with traveler's checks. So all of that belongs in M1. But that's probably not a broad enough definition of money to really capture the notion of money as purchasing power. So a less narrow definition of money, and the one favored by economists when they study the relationship between the quantity of money and economic behavior is called M2, capital M, number 2. That that definition of money, M2, equals everything in M1 plus savings deposits, including money market deposit accounts, and small denomination time deposits at depository institutions, leaving out IRA and Keogh balances, and balances in retail money market deposit accounts, again, accepting IRA and Keogh balances. Let's pause for a minute and understand that. Why ought those items be part of our definition of money? Very simply, if you've got funds in a money market mutual fund or something like it, you realize that you can quickly deposit those in your checking account or receive a cashier's check for them and use them to purchase goods. That's why they're part of our money supply. And by the way, when I showed you a graph earlier in which I showed you the connection between money growth and inflation, it was M2 that I used. Our broadest definition of money is M3, which includes everything in M2, plus balances in institutional money markets and large denomination time deposits and large so-called repurchase agreements of depository institutions. And also euro dollars. These are dollars held by U.S. Citizens at foreign locations. I'm not even going to talk about that. Most economists acknowledge that M3 includes additional highly liquid assets, but typically revert to M2 when they're interested in talking about the money supply. Take a look at a table that provides data on the quantity of money in the United States in December 2005. Let's first take a look at the components of M1 so we can answer the question, how large was the money supply back then? Currency, $724 billion in that December time. Traveler's checks, $7 billion. Demand deposits, $321 billion. And other checkable deposits, $317 billion. So M1, the narrowest definition of money, was $1,369 billion. M2, which added all those other assets that were liquid, like money market mutual fund balances, much larger, $6,676 billion. And M3, larger still, $10,154 billion. Now, notice before we go on that bank loans are not counted in any of our money definitions. But, and somewhat ironically, as we shall now see, banks create money when they lend to borrowers. Commercial banks of all our financial intermediaries are special firms in that they are the only private financial institutions that can and do create money. But how do they do that? The key is that transactions balances at commercial banks are counted as money. They're part of even the narrowest definition of the money supply. So the first thing we must realize is that demand deposits at banks are money. They are money because economic decision makers regard them to be money. And they use those balances, those decision makers, in much the same way they use currency, to buy what they want and pay what they owe. Sometimes decision makers do have a strong preference for currency. Every time I go to New York, I carry more cash than I normally would when I go to other places or stay at home, because New York is a place where sometimes only cash can be used to buy things. But generally, and most of the time, decision makers regard balances in their checking account to be money. Why? Because they can easily use those balances to buy what they want and pay what they owe. So, exactly how do banks create money? I'm going to illustrate this story with a sequence of stylized balance sheets, T accounts. The story begins with a deposit of $1,000 in cash by some bank customers who finds it convenient to exchange currency for a bank deposit. The bank, I assume, faces a legal requirement to hold reserves equal to at least 10% of deposits. But the customer's decision to deposit cash has now left the bank with extra reserves or excess reserves. For that $1,000 deposit, the bank is only required to hold $100 in cash as a reserve against the new deposit, but has a whole $1,000 in cash after the deposit is made. So the bank now uses its excess reserves to support a new loan of $9,000. It picks one of its loan applicants that it deems worthy and lends that individual $9,000. It credits the deposit account of the borrower with $9,000. It adds $9,000 to that depositor account. And at that moment, the bank has created money. Now, how did I choose $9,000? Well, I chose it as the largest increase in deposits that the bank could accommodate with $900 in excess reserves, given that the reserve requirement is 10%. And simply 900 divided by 10.1 is $9,000. Now, I'm making a simplifying assumption. None of the cash leaks out of the bank vault or out of the bank's balance sheet when the borrowers spend it. But don't worry about that. If bank customers spend those new loan funds with customers at other banks, that simply means that this expansion of money process transfers from the one bank to another. It's not really important, and I won't really dwell on it. At the end of the day, the deposit of $1,000 in cash increases the money supply by $9,000 because commercial banks use the cash as reserves, superdollars, to support the deposits they create when they write new loans. Because banks are required by law to only keep a fraction of their deposits in the form of reserves, banks create liquidity. That is, they can use $1,000 of currency to support more than $1,000 of deposits. We saw $10,000. The ability to create liquidity is the ability to lend. If banks were required to hold 100% of their reserves against their deposits, they would not be able to lend, and they would be simple repositories. As we shall see in a later lecture, bank loans are a crucial source of funds for investors. Without loans, many potential investors would not be able to grow their businesses. If the reserve requirement had been 20%, it's not. The deposit of $1,000 would have allowed the banks to create only $4,000 in deposits and money. On the other hand, if it had been lower, 5%, the deposit would have allowed banks to create ultimately $20,000 in deposits and money. As we come to the end of this lecture, it's fair to ask now how people should think of bankers once they really know what bankers do. A banker is someone who helps a customer realize plans to purchase equipment for their businesses, purchase a home, purchase a car, or purchase something else. Of course, our newfound realization of the business of bankers does not completely rehabilitate their image. Banks and bankers came under a tremendous amount of valid criticism for banking practices that contributed to the subprime mortgage crisis. In a later lecture, we'll look at that crisis and think about the role of banks and bankers again. But for now, let me ask you, how do you think about banks and how do you think about bankers?
Lecture 12, Central Banks.
In today's lecture, we are going to talk about the most important financial institution in the United States. This institution is entrusted to maintain and protect the wealth of the United States. This institution is in charge of guarding the value of the U.S. dollar. This institution has strong regulatory control over commercial banks and other financial firms. Every developed nation in the world has one of these institutions. So what is this powerful institution? The first answer that will come to mind to many when we talk about the wealth of the United States is Fort Knox, the U.S. gold repository. But Fort Knox, while formidable in appearance, is nowhere near as important as the institution about which I will speak today. In fact, the role of Fort Knox today is like the role of our Strategic Petroleum Reserve. I think I've mentioned that before. It's a secure storehouse of a valuable resource. It's nothing more. The institution I have in mind appears far less formidable than Fort Knox, but it is far more important to our national wealth. It is far more important to our national welfare. It is far more powerful, and it is far more essential to our financial system. The institution I have in mind is the Federal Reserve. The building that might be considered the home of the Federal Reserve, although the Fed, as we call it, has many branches and many buildings, is the Martin Building in Washington, D.C., which houses the offices of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. The Board of Governors comprises the individuals who control the United States Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States. In today's lecture, I will look at central banks and explain why they are the most important financial institutions in the world. Ironically, central banks do not offer banking services to private citizens like you or like me, or like the business where you work. Instead, they provide banking services to commercial banks, and that's why the Federal Reserve is sometimes referred to as the banker's bank. And, as I mentioned, they also enforce some of the laws that regulate commercial banks and other financial firms. But the real source of the power of the U.S. Federal Reserve and of central banks throughout the world is that they are entrusted with the ability to control an economy's interest rates. And they are entrusted with the responsibility to fight inflation and recessions. While the U.S. Federal Reserve is widely considered to be the most powerful among the central banks, in part because people all over the world hold dollars as part of their financial strategies, other central banks are also very important. The Bank of England was founded in 1694 to act as the government's banker and debt manager. It is the oldest central bank that we will consider in this lecture series. The Central Bank of Sweden, founded in 1668, is generally considered to be the oldest. Also of great importance is a very young central bank, the European Central Bank. The European Central Bank was created by the Treaty of Amsterdam, oversee monetary policy in the euro area. Leaders of the European Economic Community reached agreement on a currency union in which union member nations would adopt a common currency, and they reached that agreement with the Maastricht Treaty in February of 1992. The euro, as you may remember, was launched in 1999 And euro paper currency and coins began to circulate in 2002. The European Central Bank is located in Frankfurt, Germany. And the sculpture pictured in front of the European Central Bank is the actual logo of the euro. Finally, let's take a brief look at a central bank that is increasingly important in the 21st century and will be even more important as time passes. The picture is of the People's Bank of China and the building that houses that bank in Beijing, about which we will learn much more in future lectures. Let me offer you a brief history of the United States Federal Reserve. It was front page news when President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act in December of 1913. The act stated that its intent was, and I quote, to provide for the establishment of the Federal Reserve banks, to furnish an elastic currency, to afford means of rediscounting commercial paper, to establish a more effective supervision of banking in the United States, and for other purposes. Let me unpack that statement for you for a moment. What the enactors of the Federal Reserve meant, of the Federal Reserve Act meant, by an elastic currency was that the Federal Reserve would have the tools necessary to expand the money supply and contract it, to make the currency stretch, if you like, and snap back. That was considered to be very, very important as part of the strategy of allowing the Federal Reserve Bank to not only facilitate growth in the United States, but also to be a bulwark against banking panics. And what the act meant about when it said the rediscounting of commercial paper, it simply meant that the Federal Reserve Act allowed the Federal Reserve to accept from banks loans that they had made to private companies in exchange for currency. This would be very, very important when a rush would occur on commercial banks and they did not have sufficient cash to be able to meet the demand for their depositors. Enter the Fed, which could exchange some of their loans for cash. Now, as we certainly recall from the first and second lectures, the United States had tried before to create a Federal Reserve Bank. It chartered the first Bank of the United States in 1791 and the second Bank of the United States in 1860. But we also know that both banks were given initial charters only of 20 years and that neither bank saw its charter renewed. The Federal Reserve Act has been amended many times since its initial enactment in December of 1913. I'm only going to hit a few highlights. In the 1930s, the Federal Reserve Act was amended to create the Federal Open Market Committee, which was empowered to conduct monetary policy. That committee is called the Open Market Committee because it oversees purchases by the Fed and sales by the Fed of government bonds in the open market. So in point of fact, it is the Federal Open Market Committee that decides on purchases of Treasury bonds and sale of Treasury bonds. And it follows that it is the Federal Open Market Committee that decides on interest rate targets for the Federal Reserve and decides on strategies to hit those targets. Announcements by the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee are closely watched by financial analysts. It's big news when FOMC announces an increase in the so-called federal funds rate, and we'll learn about the federal funds rate in the future. Analysts know that an increase in the federal funds rate will shortly tighten credit markets and raise interest rates across the board. As a result, investment projects will be harder to finance, mortgage rates and rates on auto loans will rise as well. Of course, it's also big news when the FOMC announces a decrease in the federal funds rate, because that decrease is a harbinger of lower rates and looser credit markets. We'll see how this works later in the course when we talk specifically about monetary policy. Another amendment of the Federal Reserve Act was put in place when President Carter signed the Humphrey-Hawkins Act into law in 1978. The Humphrey is Hubert Humphrey. The act required the Federal Reserve Chairman to report twice annually to Congress. So we have pictures of Bernanke going up the hill in part because of that act. And that act, the Humphrey-Hawkins Act, also spoke to the monetary policy goals and objectives of the Federal Reserve. The act explicitly instructs the nation to strive toward 4 ultimate goals: full employment of resources, growth in production, price stability, and balance of trade and budget. Although in modern times, in the current year, we normally think of the Fed's mandate as having 2 parts: stable prices and low inflation rates is the first part of the mandate, and full employment of resources is the second. In 1999, President Clinton signed into law the Financial Services Modernization Act, which effectively repealed some of the restrictions placed on banks in the 1930s after the Great Depression. And that turns out to be very important, so important that we'll study the what and why of that particular act in a later lecture. What does a central bank do? One way to answer the question is to take a look at the balance sheet of a central bank. We will see that investigating the balance sheet is as close as economists come to archaeology, if you like. The balance sheet contains current evidence about the Fed's behavior and evidence that reveals its history. So let's dig. What we see is one of the most important assets of the Federal Reserve are gold certificates, $11 billion worth on December 28, 2005. Why that date? Let me explain. I chose that date in particular because the United States was near full employment, and we could imagine that the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve was, shall we say, in a condition that was normal for a time when the economy was at full employment, where times were good economically speaking. We're going to see a little later on that the Fed's balance sheet looks very, very different in the depths of a recession. But I digress. We see that the Federal Reserve owns something called gold certificates, $11 billion worth. And it also owns something called special drawing rights, $2.2 billion worth. These are vestiges from the gold standard. The Federal Reserve acquired those gold certificates as a result of an earlier time when it was required to back the U.S. dollar with gold. And it acquired the special drawing rights as part of an IMF attempt to keep the gold standard alive by issuing paper gold. The Federal Reserve also has coin among its assets, and importantly, far more important than the coin, $744 billion worth of U.S. Treasury securities. Now, those Treasury securities are a very important part of history. We've talked many times already in this course, and we will continue to talk about governments that print money in order to pay their bills and finance their deficits. And this is a time when we do a check here and realize that's not literally true. What happens is that treasuries borrow to finance deficits, but central banks and the U.S. Federal Reserve sometimes buy some of those bonds, essentially printing or creating money to do that acquisition. And that's how our Federal Reserve has ended up with $744 billion in government bonds, at least at the end of 2005. We also have something on the asset side of the balance sheet called a repurchase agreement. This is an interesting asset as well. A repurchase agreement is a particular kind of reversible agreement, and the Federal Reserve uses these when it attempts to, say, buy government bonds and also hold them for only a particular amount of time and then resell them. The actual asset it ends up acquiring is called a repurchase agreement. There are some other asset items, relatively small. We see loans, those are to banks. Items in the process of collection, those are important because the Federal Reserve has, through time, helped clear checks. And of course, there's bank premises and other assets. Total assets, $850 billion. The liability side of the Federal Reserve balance sheet is also interesting. And here we see something extremely important right at the top. The number one liability of the Federal Reserve are Federal Reserve notes, our paper currency, $759 billion worth. We also have an item called reverse repurchase agreements. They're the counterpart of repurchase agreements, but in the opposite direction. We have deposits by depository institutions. Okay, so $17.1 billion. And what are these? These are the deposits of commercial banks at the Federal Reserve. Likewise, our own Treasury has deposits of $4.2 billion at our Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve is not only the banker's bank, it's also our government's bank. Our Treasury pays its bills by drawing on its deposit account at the Federal Reserve. The deferred availability of cash items is the counterpart, an accounting entry that again refers to the fact that the Federal Reserve plays a role in clearing checks. The net worth of the Federal Reserve is $28 billion. So, in summary, what is it that we learn when we do this archaeology activity from the balance sheet of the Fed? The most important things we learn are that the Fed balance sheet helps us to understand what economists mean when they say that governments sometimes print money to finance their deficits. The Treasury issues bonds and bills to finance its deficits, but the Fed sometimes buys those bonds and bills. When it buys them, it finances those purchases by creating new deposits. So when we say that governments sometimes print money to finance their deficits, what we mean is that governments issue bonds and that central banks create new deposits in favor of commercial banks and use those balances to buy the bonds from the Treasury. In the previous lecture, I explained that commercial banks create money. Let me clarify. When a commercial bank makes a new loan to a customer, it adds funds to a customer's deposit account. Because the money supply of the United States includes checkable deposits, the commercial bank increases the supply of money when it makes a new loan. When the Federal Reserve buys a Treasury security, it pays for the security by adding funds to the deposit account of a commercial bank. Remember, it's the banker's bank. That, in turn, makes it possible for the bank to make new loans and create new deposits. We'll look at this process in detail a bit later. We also learned that the Fed helps commercial banks clear checks. The items in process of collection and the deferred availability of cash item entries in the balance sheet result when the Fed receives a check from a commercial bank, holds it for a time until it can be presented to another commercial bank for payment. That check may actually pass from coast to coast, from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York to the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. We also understand from our study of the balance sheet of the Fed that the Fed functions as the paymaster of the Treasury. The Treasury actually has a checking account at the Fed. Now, it would be interesting, even if the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States had a balance sheet that was somewhat unique. But let's check for a minute and verify that the balance sheet of the Bank of England tells a very similar story with only a couple of differences. Looking at the balance sheet of the Bank of England, we see that it too owns government securities, about £15.5 billion. It owns some other securities, $26.9 billion. It makes loans, which in their balance sheet are called advances, and it owns bank premises. On the liability side, we see that it too has as a liability pound sterling notes, 40.3 billion of them. However, unusually, there are some public deposits at the Bank of England which are of historical interest but not of interest to us. And we also note that it too, the Bank of England, also is the banker's bank. Banks have about 3.3 billion pounds deposits at the Bank of England. At the end of the day, we realize that the Bank of England functions a lot like the Federal Reserve Bank. The largest assets and liabilities are securities owned by the bank and currency issued by the bank. Both commercial banks and private citizens may have deposits at the Bank of England. The Bank of England makes loans to commercial banks, and the Bank of England maintains separate accounts for deposits that commercial banks hold as reserves and other deposits. One interesting difference is that the Bank of England does not list any net worth. Its assets equal its liabilities. And the reason for that is that the Treasury of England owns by law the net worth of the Bank of England. That's a matter of law and of no particular importance for us. What is very important is a better understanding of why central banks are the most powerful financial institutions in the world. Well, central banks are responsible for growth in the nation's supply of money. When the Fed creates additional money and thus increases in the money supply at an appropriate rate, it helps the economy grow by providing the new dollars that are necessary to support the transactions associated with growth. We saw in a previous lecture that in a period of time when the money supply grew not rapidly enough, in the last quarter of the 19th century, there was actual price deflation. There were 2 recessions, and there was a banking panic. So it's very, very important for the Federal Reserve to allow the money supply to grow at a rate that keeps pace with the productive growth in an economy. When we looked at a cross-country comparison of inflation and money growth rates, remember, please, that we defined excess money growth as the money growth that created inflation. And we defined excess money growth as money growth beyond the rate necessary to just keep pace with real economic growth, which we measured in that case as the growth in income. When the Federal Reserve increases money supply too rapidly, however, the rate of inflation does increase, and the value of the dollar in terms of other currency falls. Looking over some decades of data provides examples of when the Fed has gotten it right and when the Fed has gotten it wrong. If we look between 1955 and 1965 at that decade, the growth in the base money supply, the supply that the Federal Reserve controls, was 3%. Real GDP growth was 3.9%. And inflation was very, very small, 1.8%. Very different story about the decade from 65 to 75. Money growth, 6.8%. Real growth in gross domestic product, only 2.9%. And not surprisingly, the inflation rate rose to 5.5% on average in the decade. I know that certain years in that decade had higher inflation rates. But we got an even worse decade just ahead. In the decade between 1975 and 1985, the Fed allowed the money growth rate to rise to 8.1%. Yeah, real GDP growth was slightly higher, 3.4%, but the major impact was an inflation rate on average for that decade of 6.1%. In the next decade, 85 to 95, the Fed allowed the money growth rate to be 8% again. The GDP growth rate was 2.8%, and surprisingly, the inflation rate was only 2.8%. But I attribute that to the belief on the part of individuals that under first the Volcker regime at the Federal Reserve and then the Greenspan regime at the Federal Reserve, that the Fed was beginning to decrease the rate of money growth. And indeed, between 1995 and 2005, the money growth rate fell to 6%. The growth rate of the United States, the real growth rate, rose to 3.3%, and inflation came under control to 2.1%. We will look in more detail at how central banks stimulate and destimulate the economy in later lectures. For now, we're going to end by reconsidering how crucial it is for central banks to get it right. We have learned today that central banks are the most powerful institutions in the world because they have the power to increase or decrease the money supplies of their respective economies. When they get it right, economies grow and inflation stays in check. When they get it wrong, they either stifle growth by keeping money growth too low, or they create inflation by allowing money growth to be too high. And when they get it very wrong, as in the case of Germany in the 1920s, or Zimbabwe today, hyperinflation can be the result. The bottom line is that the Federal Reserve, because of its power and awesome responsibility, is the most powerful financial institution in the world. Thank you very much.